Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Today we leave open roads behind and step onto the yellow school buses of rural Texas. These are not childhood stories. These are things drivers never talk about. The students who vanished without a trace. Empty bus stops. At dawn where someone was watching. Radio static that plays only on certain highways after dark. Real accounts from former students, retired drivers, and locals of what happened when the roads went quiet. Some buses drove themselves. Others never. Reached their final stop. 20 true disturbing encounters on Texas school buses. Once you sit behind those faded vinyl seats, you might not be the only one riding. Most people just scroll past. They listen, feel the chill, and disappear. Do not make that mistake. Subscribe now. It is free and it keeps the horror alive. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Tell me in the comments. Let us begin. Asterisk. It was still dark when Eddie Velasquez pulled his bus out of the dusty school lot in Pecos. The depot lights hummed behind him, flickering slightly in the rear view as he turned south on the FM road, the horizon barely showing the first blush of daylight. His route hadn't changed in years. He knew every stop, every mailbox, every pothole, and every kid by name and face. Most mornings passed in silence, just the low drone of the engine, the occasional cough from a sleepy student, and the familiar creak of vinyl seats as they shifted. Under the weight of backpacks and bodies, that morning started no differently. Eddie sipped bitter gas station coffee and adjusted his cap. The first stop brought the Morales twins, quiet boys who never caused trouble. They always sat in the second row and shared a pair of earbuds. At the second stop, Eddie opened the doors like always. The ranch gate there was busted and never latched right, and most days he saw one of the Vega boys trotting up the dirt path, half-dressed and chewing on something from his mother's kitchen. But that morning, someone else was waiting. A boy. Stood still beside the barbed wire fence. Thin, pale. Shirt buttoned up to the throat. No backpack. No expression. He walked on quietly when the doors hissed open. Gave Eddie a single glance. Not hostile, not grateful. Just enough to acknowledge him, and then made his way down the aisle to the very back of the bus. He didn't speak. Didn't look at the other kids. Just sat down in the left corner seat. Eddie blinked and watched him in the rearview mirror as he pulled away. The boy didn't turn his head once, even as the landscape shifted past the window. For a moment, Eddie figured maybe he was a new kid. A cousin staying over for a few weeks. Maybe someone from across the border whose folks had moved in with relatives. It wasn't unheard of. But still, he usually got a heads up when a new student joined his route. When he made it to the next pickup, a tall kid named Trevor climbed aboard and immediately froze when he reached the back. Eddie saw it in the mirror. Trevor stood still, brows knitted, eyes narrowed. Then he turned and sat near the middle instead, not saying a word. The rest of the ride to the school was uneventful. Just the usual sluggish energy of early morning teenagers. When they got to the drop-off loop, Eddie parked, pulled the lever, and waited as the kids shuffled off. But the boy never left. Eddie looked up. All the seats were empty. Even the Morales twins had gone. But that last seat in the back, the one on the left, still had someone in it. The boy sat quietly, staring forward, not blinking. Eddie cleared his throat and stood up. "Hey, buddy." "School time." No answer. He walked down the aisle slowly. His boots echoed on the rubber floor. The air felt heavier the closer he got to the back. Like the engine wasn't the only thing making the air vibrate. When he reached the seat, he stopped. Cold. The seat was empty. Completely empty. But Eddie had seen him. He had seen that boy sit down. Had seen him through the mirror. Had seen Trevor pause and look straight at him. But now the space was hollow. No bag. No books. Nothing. Eddie ran a hand over his face, told himself maybe the boy slipped past while he was distracted, but something about it felt wrong. He checked the school attendance sheet later that day. No new students had enrolled. No visitors, no transfers. He even called the Vega family, just to be sure. None of their cousins were visiting. They hadn't sent anyone out that morning. Still, he let it go. For a while, until the next week. It was a Tuesday when the boy appeared again. Same stop, same stance, same pale shirt buttoned tight. This time, Eddie watched him closely. He saw the boy walk on silent, saw him pass the Morales twins and settle in the back left seat. This time, Trevor didn't even get on the bus. His mother said he had gotten sick and couldn't stop crying after the last ride. Eddie made it to the school. Same thing. Everyone got off. The boy DIDN single quotes this time. Eddie didn't wait. He stood up and marched straight to the back the moment the last student stepped off. But again, the seat was empty, not just empty cold. The vinyl felt like it had been sitting in shade for hours, not under a morning sun. He pressed his hand to the window, frosted with condensation. The other windows were dry. He didn't mention it to anyone. Not his dispatcher, not the school. Because what would he say? That some ghost kid had boarded his bus and disappeared before first period? That his seat was haunted? It sounded crazy. But each week, the boy came back. Always at the same stop. Always sat in the same place. Eventually, Eddie tried skipping the stop altogether. Just rolled past it without slowing down. There was no one standing there anyway, not visibly. But when he looked in the mirror 3 stops later, the boy was sitting in the back again, same position. Same stillness. He started asking quiet questions around town. Nothing official. Just side conversations. At the gas station or church. Someone finally told him there'd been a wreck back in the late 90s. A bus rolled over just a few miles from that gate. One of the kids in the back hadn't made it. Died at the scene. The ranch he'd lived on had been sold off after the funeral. Torn down. Rebuilt. The family left town. Eddie didn't sleep much that night. He tried everything. Blessed the bus. Parked it facing the opposite direction. Even left the back seat taped off with a wet paint sign once. But the boy always came. And every time he appeared, something strange happened. A radio would cut out. The air would grow cold. A window wouldn't reflect sunlight properly. Once, the engine refused to start until Eddie walked to the back and whispered, "I see you," out loud. And still, the boy said nothing. It was early March when things changed. A new kid got on, just moved from Odessa. Sat near the front, real friendly, real talkative. But that morning, when the bus passed that same gate, the new kid stood up and looked down the aisle toward the back. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing. "Eddie's." Hands clenched on the wheel. "Who?" he said, trying to sound calm. The boy in the back seat. He looked sick. Eddie didn't answer. He just kept driving. When they arrived at the school, the new kid walked off slowly, staring behind him. The whole time, Eddie waited, heart thudding, watching that same back seat through the mirror. This time, the boy got up. He stood in the aisle, turned, and looked straight at Eddie. His face was pale. Eyes sunken. Shirt smeared with something dark. He didn't. Blinked, and then he walked toward the front. Every step was quiet. Eddie couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The boy stopped at the front of the bus, just before the stairs. Turned his head slightly. "Thank you," he said. It was the only time he ever spoke. Then he stepped down and disappeared into the schoolyard crowd. Eddie never saw him again. He still drives the same route, still checks his mirror at that second. Stop. The Morales twins graduated. Trevor moved away. The Odessa kid never took the bus after that year. But every now and then, When the mornings are cold and the engine stutters just a little too long before turning over, Eddie swears he can feel a presence in the back, like someone just barely missing from the seat. He doesn't speak to it, but he always nods at the mirror, just in case. The morning it happened, the desert sky over Presidio was still a shade of bruised gray. The first hints of dawn smeared above the jagged outline of the Shinati Mountains. The town sat quiet, dead quiet, the kind of silence that feels too still for a place where people are supposed to live. The dogs weren't barking. No early risers gunned their pickups down the highway. The air was thick with heat even before the sun rose, and yet something about that morning made the sweat on people's backs feel colder than usual. By 6:50 a.m., the dispatcher at the Presidio Consolidated Independent School District had already made 3 calls, first to the transportation supervisor, then to the principal at the high school, and finally to the sheriff's department. Not a single one of them had an answer for what she'd seen on the security monitor. Bus number 17, which had been parked and locked since May, rolling up the depot driveway, smooth and deliberate, its headlights off but the amber hazard lights blinking, in sync with the pulsing dread in her chest. The surveillance footage would later confirm what she already knew in her gut. The bus had started itself at 5:12 a.m. sharp. No driver entered the vehicle. No keys were inserted into the ignition. It simply rumbled to life, pulled out of the depot lot, and drove off into the darkness, taking the usual morning route along Farm to Market Road 170, the river road winding its way past dry creek beds, skeletal mesquite trees, and old ranch houses with boarded-up windows. It made every stop. Not a single one was missed. There were no passengers. Not a soul waiting on the corners. No children stood there anymore. They hadn't in years. Bus number 17 was a 2003 Bluebird, half-rusted and always ran hot. It had been taken out of service the previous spring after a kid had puked blood onto the vinyl seatbacks and passed out cold on the floor. They never found out what was wrong with him. He never woke up, died in the year 3 hours later. Internal bleeding, the doctors said. But what caused it, well, no one could say. There'd been no wound, no sign of trauma. His mother, Lupe Morales, swore he'd been fine that morning. Ate a bowl of cereal, played with his baby sister, kissed her goodbye like he always did. After that, no one wanted to ride bus #17. The district parked it behind the maintenance shed, half shielded from the sun by an old tin awning. The drivers joked about it sometimes, called it La Bestia or the Widowmaker, but nobody thought much of it. Nobody until that morning, when it rolled back into the depot by itself. By 7 o'clock, Sheriff Antonio Villarreal stood beside the dispatcher and 2 maintenance guys, watching the security tape again and again. The bus came alive like it had a mind of its own, rolled out of the shadows and turned left down the dirt service road, just like a trained driver would have done. There was no human figure on the footage, no movement inside the cab, just the empty driver's seat lurching forward with no one touching the wheel. This some kind of prank? One of the mechanics asked, his voice quaking like a boy's. Villarreal didn't answer. He was staring at the time stamp 6:44 a.m., the exact time the bus pulled in and stopped itself. The exact time, 20 years earlier to the minute, when another bus, also number 17, had plunged off the road during a rainstorm just outside town. 19 kids died. The driver, a man named Harold Epley, was decapitated when the bus hit a mesquite tree. They found his head 15 yards from the wreck. There wasn't much talk of the crash anymore. Not in public anyway. The town had tried to bury it, paved over the spot on the road where the wreckage had smoldered, planted a crepe myrtle that never bloomed. But Presidio was a place where the dead didn't stay buried. Not for long. The thing was, that accident had been blamed on driver error, a moment of distraction. But Harold Epley's widow, who still lived in a trailer outside Redford, swore up and down that the bus had never responded to him. She said he called her the night before the crash, panicked, said something was wrong with the steering, that the brakes didn't feel right. Said he kept seeing things out on the route, lights in the desert, children in the road that vanished when he looked straight at them. Nobody believed her then. She stopped talking about it after they threw her out of the memorial service for screaming about the machine eating them. Now, 20 years later to the second, the same numbered bus rolls into the depot without a driver. The town tried to stay calm. The school board issued a statement. The sheriff's office said it was looking into the matter. But the parents knew something was wrong. They started keeping their kids home. People whispered in line at the grocery store, at the post office. The Catholic Church stayed open 24/7 for the first time since the cartel killings in '09. The next night, something else happened. At 2:16 a.m., the cameras at the depot picked up movement again. Bus number 17's hazard lights began flashing, even though the engine was off. Then the interior lights flicked on one by one, first the front, then the back, like a ripple of electricity. The rear emergency door clicked open slowly and stayed open for exactly 5 minutes before slamming shut with such force the whole vehicle rocked on its wheels. No one approached the bus. No animals, no people. Just the door opening like it was letting something in, or letting it out. The sheriff sent a deputy, Rodrigo Salazar, to sit out there overnight in a patrol truck. Just to watch. Just to keep eyes on it. By morning, Salazar's truck was still parked out front, engine running, driver's door wide open. But Salazar was gone, not a trace of him. His radio was left on the passenger seat, its mic crushed like someone had squeezed it in a vise. They found boot prints leading around the side of the maintenance shed, then nothing. Just sand and windblown dirt. The bus didn't move again. Not for 2 more days. Then, on Sunday morning, a man named Glenn Avery called 911 from Route 67, his voice cracking over the line. He was hauling livestock and had seen something that made him pull over and vomit on the side of the road. It was full, he kept saying. Full of kids, all of them pale. Just staring. He'd passed bus number 17 going north toward Marfa, alone. On the highway. Said the windows were fogged up from the inside, but he could see faces, children, packed in shoulder to shoulder. They didn't blink. Didn't move. Their mouths hung open like they were screaming, but there was no sound. No sound at all. The sheriff dispatched units immediately, but by the time they got there, the bus was gone. No tire tracks. No heat signature. Just an empty stretch of road and the faint smell of burning plastic on the wind. That afternoon, Villarreal. Went to visit Epley's widow. She was older now, stooped, her eyes milked over with cataracts, but she remembered everything. She invited him in, led him to a cedar trunk under her bed, and pulled out an old driver's journal. Epley's. In the back pages, he had written about dreams. The same dream over and over again. The road bending where it shouldn't. The smell of salt water in the desert. A voice on the intercom whispering in reverse. And a child with no eyes sitting in the second seat from the back, always in the same place. Always watching. She showed Villarreal a photograph from 1984. A black and white school picture. 19 kids. The same ones from the crash. And there, in the second row from the back, sat a child that no one could name, a boy no one remembered. Pale skin, black eyes, smiling too wide for his face. The yearbook had no name listed for him, just a blank space. The sheriff didn't sleep that night. And the next morning, bus number 17 was gone, not stolen, not towed. Gone. No tire tracks, no oil drips. just a rectangle of dustless pavement where it had rested. They say it still shows up sometimes, along the river road at dawn, or in the rearview mirror of a tired long-haul trucker, sometimes parked outside forgotten schools in dying towns. And when it does, the air grows cold. Radios fuzz out. GPS stops working. You hear it before you see it, a low diesel growl, steady and slow. And if you look too long, they say you can see them inside. The children, all of them. Still staring dot, and in the second seat from the back, a boy with no eyes, still watching. It started the first Monday of October, the kind of Monday that bled out over the Permian Basin like a rusty spill. The air was dry, sun high, the dirt pale and powdery underfoot. Monaghan's was as small and spread out as ever, wind-pushing sand. Across County Road 18 like it was trying to erase it. The old yellow school bus from Ward County, ISD, picked up kids the same as always. 10 stops between Thornton Avenue and FM 1233. Each seat had its regulars. And none of them noticed anything odd until the new girl sat down. Her name was Alyssa Garrow. Quiet, soft-spoken, and pale like she didn't belong under the West Texas sun. She'd moved in from somewhere up north, maybe Missouri, but no one cared enough to ask. Kids in Monaghan's didn't warm easy to new people. They eyed her when she stepped onto bus number 43, taking the third seat from the front on the passenger side. But it was what she did once seated that began to chip away at the ordinary. She stared into the rearview mirror, not at the kids behind her, not out the window, just up past the bald head of the driver, Mr. Cobb, and into the rectangular mirror mounted above the windshield. She didn't glance or peek. She watched like the mirror was showing her something the rest of them couldn't see. At first, no one said anything. Quiet weirdos came and went like tumbleweeds. But on Tuesday, she did the same thing. Wednesday, too. Every ride to and from school, Alyssa never turned her head. She didn't blink much either. She would sit, with her hands folded on her lap, her back straight, her eyes locked onto the mirror like her life depended on it. The other kids started whispering about it, calling her Mirror Girl, laughing behind her back. But there was something off about their laughter. Like even they didn't find it funny. By Friday, she'd stopped blinking completely. Mr. Cobb noticed first. He didn't like the way she stared. The man had driven that same route for 17 years, and nothing ever put him off before. Coyotes darting across the road, oil rigs billowing smoke, even the dead pig that once exploded under the axle. Nothing shook him, but Alyssa did. He said her eyes were wrong, like they weren't really hers. Too big, too gray, unmoving. Friday afternoon, he decided he'd had enough. The kids filed off at their usual stops, but Alyssa stayed seated. Still staring, Cobb cleared his throat, glanced back. "Your stop's coming up." No answer. "You hear me, girl? Don't make me come back there." Still no movement, but then her lips twitched and moved just slightly. "If I look away, they'll notice." Mr. Cobb frowned, turning to see if she was screwing with him. "Who's they?" Alyssa blinked once, the first time all week, then slowly raised a hand and pointed at the mirror. "They're not behind us, only in the mirror." Cobb glanced up reflexively, and for the briefest second, his heart stuttered. The reflection showed the bus behind him as it always did. Rows of green vinyl seats, sunlight streaking through dusty windows, but no kids. Every seat behind Alyssa's was empty. He looked back over his shoulder. They were all there. Bobby, Janelle, Tony, Maria, every one of them chatting or on their phones, oblivious. He looked back at the mirror, empty. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, and pulled the bus to the shoulder of the road near an old rusted-out cattle gate. He stood up, turned around fully. Kids, everyone quiet. They looked at him, puzzled. "You, Alyssa, off the bus." "I can't," she said quietly. "They'll see me." "Who?" Cobb shouted, and that's when the bus lights flickered out. It was broad daylight. But for a moment, the interior dimmed like someone had thrown a thick tarp over the bus. The air felt heavy, hotter. The radio hissed, spat static, and then cut out. Cobb was breathing hard. His hands shook as he turned again to the mirror, and now he was missing from the reflection too. All that was left was Alyssa, her eyes wide, her body rigid, still staring. "Don't look away," she whispered. "They know when you look away." Then came the banging. It started from the emergency door at the back. 3 knocks, then 4, then 6 in quick succession. Cobb turned, and all the kids were standing now, confused, some starting to cry. But none of them were near the back. "Who's back there?" he shouted, already moving, already regretting. It died as he passed the rows. The windows on both sides of the bus fogged up, smeared from the outside like greasy hands were pawing at them. Cobb reached the rear door and gripped the red lever. He yanked it open. Nothing. Just the roadside, the dead grass, the barbed wire fence stretching into the heat shimmer. But it was silent. No insects, no wind. Just heat and silence. Then something moved in the mirror. Cobb turned, slow as molasses. And there it was, not in the real world, but in the glass, crawling up the center aisle like an animal with too many limbs. It was thin gray, with joints that bent wrong and fingers that dragged along the floor. Its head was bulbous and smooth. No mouth, no eyes. But Cobb knew it saw him. It was close to Alyssa now. She never moved. Her eyes were wet, but unblinking. "Close it," she said. And Cobb slammed the door. The lights flickered again. And this time the windows cracked, hairline fractures webbing out from invisible impacts. Then, just as fast, everything snapped. Back, the light returned. The radio popped back to life. The air was still thick, but breathable. Cobb staggered back to the front and sat heavily. He didn't ask questions after that. He just drove. The next Monday, Alyssa wasn't at the stop. Her house had been abandoned overnight. Sheriff's deputies said it looked like no one had lived there in years, dust an inch thick, no furniture, no signs of recent occupancy. The real estate company said they never sold that house to a Garrow family, and no school records showed an Alyssa ever enrolled. But the bus mirror still acts. Funny. Cobb won't drive anymore. Retired early, some say. Others claim he stopped speaking altogether. The bus, number 43, sits in the Ward County vehicle lot now. Covered in dust, sun-dash bleached. But sometimes, late at night, the maintenance guys swear they see movement inside. A flicker. In the mirror. A shape crawling through the empty rows. And if you get too close, they say, the reflection doesn't match the world around you anymore. It shows what's really back there. Route 9 was a strip of worn 2-lane highway that cut through the dry hills just outside Alpine, Texas, winding past rust-colored cliffs and abandoned ranches. A place where the wind never stopped and cell service always did. It wasn't on most GPS apps anymore, either scrub it out from lack of use or deliberately left off. Locals didn't talk about it much, and when they did, they kept their voices low, like you do when someone's just died. Not a week went by without someone warning the teenagers to stay off that road after dark. They didn't always listen. In mid-July, with the kind of heat that cooked tar and split tires, 3 kids took a shortcut home down Route 9. It was late. A little past 11. They'd been swimming at Elephant Rock, that half-dried-out lake nobody really trusted but everybody used. The sun had dipped low, the mesquite trees throwing long shadows across the road as Ricky Salazar's beat-up Chevy Silverado rattled along the old pavement. He was 17, smug behind the wheel, a cigarette dangling from his lip even though he couldn't stand the taste. In the passenger seat was Danielle, Danny, who had that detached cool that made boys nervous and girls jealous. In the back was her little cousin Macy, 12 years old and too quiet for her age. They'd been on Route 9 for maybe 10 minutes when the first voice came through the intercom. The Silverado didn't even have a proper intercom system. Just a dusty little speaker rigged between the front and back seats. Ricky's dad had installed years ago when he used the truck for ranch work. It hadn't worked in months, wires half exposed and sun-faded. So when it crackled to life with a soft, slow voice that said, "Macy?" in a high, familiar tone, Ricky slammed on the brakes. Danny turned fast, eyes sharp. Macy's face had gone pale. Her little hands were shaking. "What was that?" Ricky asked, trying to play it off, the cigarette now forgotten in the ashtray. Macy didn't answer right away. She just stared at the box like it was something living. Finally, in a voice just above a whisper, she said, "That was my mom." Donnie gave a nervous laugh, too loud in the quiet truck. "No way. It's probably just radio interference or something." "It's not hooked up to anything," Ricky said. "It's been dead for years. My dad ripped out half the wiring when he installed the new stereo." The intercom crackled again. "Macy, I'm cold." This time, the voice sounded wet, like someone trying to speak through water. Ricky tried to restart the engine, but the truck had gone completely silent, headlights dimming until only the dying orange glow of the dashboard lit their faces. Outside, the wind had stopped. The world around them held its breath. Donnie reached out and touched Macy's shoulder. "Your mom died in a car wreck 2 years ago, right?" Macy nodded, her lips trembling. She's not cold anymore," Danny said gently. Macy looked her dead in the eye and said, "We never found her body. The car was upside down in the wash. They said she might have washed away, but they never found her." The silence was thick. Then the truck's lights flickered back on. Without a word, Ricky turned the key. This time the engine caught. The radio sputtered. They pulled back onto Route 9, going faster than they should have. The road stretched long and black under the starlit sky, but it didn't feel like they were moving forward. After a mile, Ricky noticed something. The GPS on his phone showed they hadn't moved. Still on Route 9, same point they'd been 10 minutes ago. The road outside looked the same too. Same rock with the bullet hole, same dead deer off the shoulder, same twisted mesquite tree. "We're looping," he muttered. "I want to go home," Macy said, her voice barely audible. They passed the same landmarks again. Donnie pulled out her phone, opened the compass app. The needle spun uselessly. Then, as they crossed what looked like the same patch of road a third time, the intercom came to life again. "He's with me." The voice was deeper this time. A man's voice, slow, flat. Ricky turned off the engine and coasted to a stop, heart pounding. Donnie was shaking her head, muttering "nope, nope, nope" over and over. Macy spoke before anyone else could. "That's my dad." Ricky stared at her in the rearview mirror. "He's dead too?" Macy didn't nod this time. She just said, "He drowned last year. They never found his body either." The truck felt colder now, like something was pulling the heat out from inside. Outside, the shadows shifted. Not the trees or the rocks, the actual darkness itself seemed to move. Shapes that didn't match anything natural. Ricky put the truck in reverse and backed up until the shoulder turned to gravel. He tried to make a 3-point turn, but the headlights caught something in the middle of the road. A figure, standing still, long hair plastered across a thin face, bare feet, a woman in a pale blouse soaked down to the ribs. Her head tilted slightly to one side, just enough to feel wrong. Danny screamed. Ricky stomped the gas. The figure vanished as soon as the headlights passed over her. The truck tore down the road, engine howling. The intercom buzzed again. "Come with me, baby. I'm not cold anymore." The road shimmered up ahead like heat waves, but it wasn't heat. It was moving wrong, folding in on itself. The truck jolted like they'd hit a pothole, but there hadn't been any. Then they were back at the same dead deer, the same bullet-riddled. Rocked out Ricky pulled the truck to a stop and turned to Macy. "You have to tell me what this is. What's happening?" Macy didn't answer right away. She looked down, then said, "I used to talk to her after she died. I thought it was just my imagination. In my room at night, I'd hear her voice. Then I heard Dad's. They wanted me to come visit them. I thought maybe I could." Danny grabbed her arm. "Macy, you don't go with them. You never go with them. They said it wouldn't hurt." The wind picked up again. Not? A breeze, a hard, sudden gust that slammed into the truck. The intercom spat static. "You brought them. That's good. We needed more." That wasn't a voice Macy recognized. The back window shattered. Something cold and wet curled inside, like smoke. It moved wrong. No shape, no source, just a sense of drowning, of being pulled down. Donnie screamed as it touched her face. Ricky floored it. This time, they passed the bullet-riddled rock and it was gone. The deer was gone. They were out. Highway widened, straightened, and the GPS finally updated. The lights of Alpine shimmered ahead. They didn't stop until they reached Ricky's house. All three of them sat inside for an hour, staring at the dashboard, afraid to speak. The next day, Ricky took the truck apart, yanked out every wire connected to the intercom, threw the speaker into a fire pit out back. That night, it spoke again, through his bedroom wall, just a whisper. "Ricky, come back." And from the reports that started trickling in over the next few weeks, they weren't the only ones who heard it. Kids near Route 9 began hearing voices in their walkie-talkies and baby monitors, even when the batteries were gone. Always calling them by name, always familiar. Sometimes they said they were cold. Sometimes they said they weren't anymore. Nobody drives Route 9 at night anymore. But some still hear the voices when they pass close enough, especially if they've lost someone, especially if the body was never found. The first time Marty saw the drawing, it didn't register as anything unusual. Just a smear in the cake dust across the back window of his bus, like dozens he'd seen before, fingertips dragging happy faces, crude messages, the occasional obscenity, all scrawled by bored teenagers or some curious kid passing by. But when he stepped back with his rags still wet with Windex and caught the full outline of it in the golden light of the Fort Stockton sunset, something about it tugged at the edges of his memory. Not familiarity exactly, but unease, like a dream. You almost remember but can't quite grab hold of. It was a child's drawing, no doubt. The lines were wobbly and the perspective all wrong. Buildings tilted as if leaning into the wind, roads that curved without reason. But it wasn't random. There was structure to it. Marty counted 8 rectangles, each with scribbles inside that looked like buildings, benches, or lampposts. In between them were skinny lines, roads he assumed snaking from one rectangle to the next. And just beneath each drawing, carefully scratched into the dust with a fingertip, were names: Del Rio Circle, Apache Plaza, Midland Transfer. Names Marty recognized because they were stops on his route. His exact route, all the way from the northern gas station outside Fort Stockton down to the decrepit little hub near Alpine Road. All of them. Right down to the spacing. Except one. Just before the last stop, squeezed between Culver Trail and Alpine Road Depot, was a box that read Crane Woman Hollow. Marty frowned at it, then read it again. He didn't remember any place. with that name. And he'd been driving this route going on 6 years. The roads, the towns, the bus schedules, they didn't change out here. The desert had a way of holding on to things, keeping them where they were planted. He wiped the window clean. The drawing came off in one easy swipe. He finished cleaning, locked up, and walked across the lot to his truck. But that night, even as he lay on his couch with the beer and the TV buzzing low, something about that name wouldn't leave his head. Crane Woman Hollow. It had a strange weight to it. It didn't sound like something a kid made up. It sounded old. By morning, he'd almost forgotten the whole thing. The air was already warming as he rolled into the yard at 6:10 a.m. Thermos steaming in the Q folder, the sun just beginning to drag itself over the hills. He did his pre-trip inspection, climbed into his seat, and backed out of the depot. First stop was Easy Del Rio Circle. A couple of high schoolers, headphones in. Second was Apache Plaza. One older lady with groceries and a man in scrubs. Same as every morning. It was at the fifth stop where everything went wrong. He pulled to the shoulder after Culver Trail, where there was usually a short stretch of unbroken desert before the next real stop at Alpine. But as he eased onto the brakes, he saw something up ahead. A bus shelter. It was tucked into a clearing at the edge of the mesquite scrub, half in shadow but unmistakable. A green metal frame, plexiglass walls, and a small bench bolted down. The kind the city put in during the mid-90s. Faded paint, old stickers, but intact. There was even a small trash can and a crook sign, Crane Woman Hollow. Marty felt the chill settle into his chest. He hadn't driven past it the day before. He was sure of that. He knew this road. There had never been anything here except dust, and weeds and the occasional tumbleweed thumping the bumper. Now, a whole stop had appeared overnight. Still, the schedule was the schedule. Maybe someone installed it as part of some long overdue extension and he just hadn't heard. But that didn't make sense. He would have gotten a memo. His supervisor, Dale, wasn't the type to forget little details like adding a whole new stop. Marty opened the doors. No one was waiting. The bench was empty, the surrounding desert still. He waited the usual 15 seconds, more out of habit than hope, then shut the doors again. As the bus lurched forward, he caught sight of something carved into the plexiglass behind the bench. A drawing. No color, just lines etched in plastic. 8 rectangles connected by a snake-like road, each labeled, including Crane Woman Hollow. That night, Marty pulled Dale aside after shift. They sat on folding chairs outside the break room, the air warm and dry, the buzz of insects in the mesquite bushes behind the fence. Dale listened patiently, but when Marty finished, he only scratched the back of his neck and frowned. Look, man, we haven't added anything to that route. I'd know. If someone tagged a new shelter, it wasn't through. US? Then how the hell did it get there? Dale shrugged. Vandalism, maybe. City project we didn't hear about yet? County's always changing hands. You think a bunch of vandals built a whole shelter with a sign and trash can? Dale didn't answer. He just looked at Marty for a long time, then stood up and sighed. Don't stress it. Skip the stop tomorrow. I'll ask around. Marty nodded, but didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, Crane Woman Hollow was still there. But this time, there was someone waiting. She was standing just outside the shelter, not on the bench, facing the road. Her clothes were gray, not dirty exactly, but old, colorless. A dress that looked like it belonged in a photo from a century ago. Her hair hung in a tangled sheet over her face, but Marty could see pale skin, bare feet caked in dust. She didn't wave, didn't move, just stared straight at him as he approached. Marty hit the brakes, hard. The bus shuddered. He stared at her through the windshield. Something about her made his throat go tight. He reached over and pressed the button to open the doors. She didn't move. He leaned toward the side mirror. "Ma'am, you getting on?" Nothing. He waited, tension crawling through him. After a few more seconds, he closed the doors again. Was gone. Just gone. Marty stepped out of the bus and jogged over to the shelter. Nothing there. No footprints. No movement. Just the desert and the hum of the wind. He circled the area, calling out, but found nothing. Eventually, he got back in the driver's seat and continued down the road. The rest of the ride was a blur by. The time he returned to the depot, he was shaking. He told Dale everything about the woman, about how she vanished. Dale didn't laugh, but he looked like he wanted to. He offered Marty a few days off, but when Marty returned the next week, the stop was still on the route, still on his GPS display, still physically there. And every time he passed it, he saw the woman. Sometimes she was on the bench. Sometimes crouching near the trash can. Once, she was standing in the middle of the road, forcing him to brake until his knees slammed into the console. She never moved, never waved, never spoke. He tried to skip the stop once, drove past it without slowing. The bus made it about half a mile before the engine sputtered and died. No warning lights. No reason. It started again the moment he turned around and opened the doors in front of the shelter. Soon, he stopped telling anyone about it. And then the dreams started dotting them. He was walking through a long tunnel of dust and smoke. The sky overhead flickered. Between day and night, stars appearing and vanishing like faulty bulbs. At the end of the tunnel was a woman with her back to him. When he got close enough, she turned. Her eyes were black pits. Her mouth opened in a soundless scream. Every time. He woke, there was dust on his bedsheets. Sometimes in little swirling patterns, like tiny fingers had drawn circles around him. Last Friday, someone new got on at Crane Woman Hollow. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, thin and pale. No parents in sight. The kid climbed the steps like he knew exactly where he was going. He didn't speak, just sat in the back seat, legs swinging. Marty called out to him. No answer. He drove the rest of the route in silence. By the time they reached the depot, the boy was gone. No one had seen him get off. The security footage showed an empty bus. Marty hasn't driven since. He sits in his apartment now, windows shut, shades drawn. The dreams are worse. The woman's getting closer. Last night, she reached for him. He checked the back window of his truck this morning. A new drawing. 9 stops now. A new box at the end. It says Marty's home. The bus was brand new, still smelling of factory plastic and hot vinyl when it first rolled down the dusty stretch of Farm Road 1690 into Sanderson, Texas. The school district hadn't bought a new bus in almost 13 years, and when this one arrived, freshly painted with its thick yellow coat and black stripe, it was met with quiet awe from the students and a little grumbling from the older drivers who didn't like the onboard cameras or the unfamiliar digital panel lighting up in front of the steering wheel. The driver, Bill Rance, had been with the district since the early 90s. He'd outlived 2 principals and 1 unfortunate shop teacher who'd been crushed under a collapsed workbench. Bill didn't care for the technology, but he liked the new air conditioning and the fact that, for once, there was no duct tape holding the seat cushions together. But almost from the first morning route, something about the bus seemed off. Not broken, not dangerous, just off. Mindo in question was third from the back on the driver's side. Outwardly, it looked like any of the others' tempered glass. Thick black rubber seal, legal safety sticker in the bottom corner, but unlike the rest, it didn't reflect. Not even a smudge of a kid's face when the morning sun hit the side. Not a wisp of cloud or a shimmer of blue sky. Just black. a sort of pulsing, oil-slick black that didn't match anything else on the bus. First to mention it was Lucy Contreras. 7th grader, sharp-eyed and shy. She didn't say it out loud, just quietly asked if she could switch seats after the first week. "That window's weird," she said, gripping her backpack strap so tightly her knuckles turned white. "It's like it's not even there." Bill shrugged, let her move up a row. Then others started avoiding that seat, even if it meant cramming. 3 into one of the smaller benches. They didn't talk about it much, just gave that dark pane of glass a wide berth. Eventually, no one sat next to it. Then came the Thursday morning when Travis Gunter, quiet boy, big eyes, a little strange, always looking just past you when he talked, sat next to the window. It wasn't by choice. His usual seat was taken, and the bus was unusually full. A few kids even noticed that Lucy was absent that day, which was odd. Since she had a near-perfect attendance record, Travis didn't make a scene. He just sat down, pressed his forehead lightly against the dark glass, and stared into it. Bill caught him in the rearview mirror as the bus rumbled through town. Travis didn't move, not to scratch his nose, not to blink. He stayed like that, the whole ride, staring into the nothing. That afternoon, he didn't show up for the return trip. The school secretary said his homeroom teacher marked him present for first and second period. Then nothing. No one remembered seeing him after lunch. His backpack was still in his locker. His phone was found buzzing in the grass just behind the school, its screen cracked and black. The sheriff came. Dogs were brought in. They swept the school and the surrounding fields, combed the dry ravines east of town. Nothing. Not a footprint, not a shred of clothing. Just gone. The kids got quieter after that. The bus got quieter. 2. Bill kept driving the same route. Same roads, same stops. The school board insisted they keep using the new bus. Coincidence, they said. Unrelated. They offered free counseling for the kids and suspended field trips for the rest of the semester. But the window didn't change. Bill started driving in silence. No radio, no morning greetings. His eyes would flit to the rearview mirror more and more often. Not to look at the kids, but to catch a glimpse of the window. One afternoon, 2 weeks. After Travis disappeared, he saw something in it. It wasn't a reflection. Not really, more like a movement. A shimmer, like heat rising off asphalt. But it was inside the glass, like something shifting under a layer of black water. He slowed the bus without meaning to. The shimmer moved again, sharper this time. A suggestion of something, an arm or a leg. Then it was gone. The next morning, Lucy returned to the bus. She was pale, thinner than before. Her hair was damp, like she hadn't dried it properly. She walked up the steps like her shoes were filled with sand. She didn't speak, didn't make eye contact. Just walked to the seat in front of the black window and sat without a word. Bill watched her the whole ride. She didn't blink. Didn't shift. Her face was turned slightly toward the window, but not pressed to it like Travis had done. When the bus arrived at school, Lucy didn't move. She stayed seated as the other students filed out. After a long moment, Bill stood and walked. Back, Lucy? Her head turned slowly. Her eyes were wrong. They weren't cloudy or glowing or anything Hollywood like that, just wrong, empty, but watching. Are you all right? He asked. She nodded once, then got up and walked down the steps, her movement stiff, like she was remembering how joints were supposed to work. Bill filed a report that afternoon, mentioned the strangeness. The school counselor brushed it off. Sawed grief affects kids differently. But when he pressed, asked if Lucy had said anything to her, the counselor admitted she hadn't spoken a word since she came back. That night, Bill returned to the depot after his evening route. He sat in the parked bus long after everyone else had gone home. The sun dipped low over the hills, painting the yard in burnt orange. He sat in the back row, across from the window. It reflected nothing. Not the rows of seats, not the dashboard, not even the golden sky outside. He reached out and touched it. The surface felt cold, colder than glass should. It was like touching the top of a frozen lake. He leaned closer. There was no sound. No hum of insects outside, no groan of the cooling engine. Just silence. Then, faintly, something shifted behind the glass. Not a figure. Not quite. More like the idea of one. It moved like it knew he was watching. Then it pressed against the inside of the pane like it was testing the boundary, his breath. Fogged the surface, but the figure didn't fade. It hovered there, closed now, close enough that Bill could see the shape of its face. It wasn't Travis. It wasn't anyone. It had too many eyes. Bill pulled his hand away and left the bus. Keys still in the ignition. The next morning, a different driver took over. Bill hadn't called in sick. He hadn't called at all. When they checked his house, it was empty. Front door locked. Lights off. His truck in the driveway. No sign of a struggle, but his shoes were sitting neatly beside the back door, as if he'd slipped out for a moment and never came back. That same day, the district quietly moved the new bus to the far corner of the lot. The transportation director requested an older model be pulled from backup rotation. Nothing official was ever said, but the kids noticed. The next few weeks passed in a kind of uneasy calm. Then one morning, the new driver Janet Barker showed up late. The backup bus wouldn't start, wouldn't even turn over. She radioed the depot. After a pause, the voice on the other end told her to just take the new one. She did. The kids stared at the bus like it was a coffin on wheels. One seat remained empty. Third from the back, driver's side. Halfway through the route, a first grader, Mason Rourke, asked about the window. "Why's it so dark?" he said, pointing. Janet glanced in the mirror. "It's tinted," she lied. "But it doesn't show anything," Mason said. "Not even me." She told him to sit down. That afternoon, Mason didn't get on the bus, and the window, still dark. Still waiting. The first time Carl Gaines subbed in as a school bus driver for Van Horn ISD, he chalked the bad directions up to poor signage and nerves. Van Horn wasn't big, just a dusty speck off I-10 in far west Texas, but its layout was like someone had dropped a handful of gravel and named each rock a street. Every road seemed to loop back on itself, and half the signs were sun-bleached or shot through with buckshot. The regular driver, a heavy-set woman named Brenda, had called out sick for the week, and Carl, who'd only just transferred in from El Paso, was handed a paper route map that looked like it had been photocopied 100 times. "Just follow the yellow lines," the dispatcher told him with a wink. "Kids'll help you out if you get turned around." That first morning, Carl showed up an hour early, unlocked the bus barn, and climbed into bus number 17, a rickety bluebird with bald tires and a cracked dashboard. The engine groaned to life like something waking up after a long, painful sleep. He adjusted the rear view, clicked his seatbelt, and followed the yellow lines. Or at least, he tried to. The route twisted through dry hills and broken mesquite fences, then dropped into a ravine before climbing a slope that wasn't marked on the map. A half-dozen kids had already been picked up, sitting in the back with their backpacks in their laps, watching him without saying much. When Carl glanced in the mirror and asked, "This look right to y'all?" none of them responded. One of the boys, maybe 12 or 13, with a choppy haircut and dirt on his jeans, pointed toward a dirt road with no street sign. Carl hesitated but turned anyway. They made it to the school 15 minutes late. The principal didn't say a word, just frowned and marked it down. Carl spent the rest of the day trying to trace what went wrong, driving the route again in his head, but by the afternoon pickup, he still didn't have it memorized. That's when it started happening again. Carl turned right onto what should have been South Hackberry, but the street was gone. In its place was a winding gravel road that led out toward the foothills. He thought maybe he'd missed the turn and circled back, but every road he took seemed to fold away from town. He tapped the brakes and tried to reverse, but the bus jerked forward instead. The kids didn't speak. They just sat quietly, staring out the windows like they were watching something distant and slow approach from across the desert. Carl's palms sweated as he gripped the wheel. It didn't turn like it should. It resisted, almost like something was holding it in place. When he let go, the wheel twitched slightly to the left and the bus drifted with it, tires crunching over gravel. He cleared his throat. Okay, he sighed, trying to smile. Not funny. Is this some kind of prank? No one answered. He tried the radio, but it was just static. Not even a squeal of feedback or the dispatcher's drawl, just a dry hiss, like sand sliding over metal. He flipped the switches back and forth, then checked the ignition. Everything looked fine, normal. The fuel gauge hovered just under full. But the desert outside had gone wrong. The flat plains that should have stretched for miles were now broken by gnarled trees, the kind you didn't see west of the Pecos. Shadows spilled longer than they should have, even though the sun still hung high in the sky. A black bird flapped across the windshield and vanished into a scrub thicket. The bus turned again, this time sharply. Too sharply, and Carl had to brace against the wheel to keep from smashing into a barbed wire fence. The kids didn't react. None of them even blinked. Listen, he said, louder now. I need y'all to tell me where we are. Where's the school? Where are the goddamn roads? The boy with the choppy hair looked up at him and said, You don't drive the bus drives you. Carl laughed, but it came out wrong tight and dry, like he was choking on dust. You think that's funny? No, said the boy. I think it's late. Carl looked out the side mirror. The sun had dropped lower than it should have, way lower. The light was thin and orange, bleeding across the hills. It hadn't been more than 20 minutes since they left the school, but it looked like nearly 6 o'clock. He pressed his foot to the brake again. Nothing. He turned the wheel hard. Still nothing. The bus just rolled, slow and steady, down the unnamed road. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. He thought about killing the engine and jumping out, but the idea of leaving the kids, if they were even real kids, felt worse than staying. He forced the wheel again, using both hands now, muscles shaking with effort. It didn't budge. It was like wrestling with stone. What's out here? He asked. Where does this road go? The boy didn't answer this time, but the girl next to him did. It goes back, she said. Back where? Back to where the first one drove. Carl didn't know what that meant, but he had a sudden vivid image of the bus buried in sand, sunken to its windows, filled with brittle bones, in tattered clothes. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thought. No, he muttered. That's not no. The bus made another turn, this one even sharper, and suddenly they were climbing. The road narrowed, squeezed between rust-colored rocks, sagebrush, scraping the sides of the bus. The sun had dipped behind the hills now, and shadows swallowed the land in a purplish gloom. The headlights flickered on automatically, casting pale cones across the road. Carl tried the door lever. It didn't move. He slammed his palm against it, twice. Open, he shouted. Let me out. The kids didn't move. Not a flinch. I'm reporting all of this, he hissed, grabbing the radio again. Still static. The bus climbed higher. Then, just as the last bit of sunlight vanished, the bus slowed to a crawl and pulled off the road into a clearing surrounded by dead trees. The branches were gnarled and blackened, like they'd been struck by lightning. The air was silent. No insects, no wind, no birds. Carl could feel something pushing at the edges of his thoughts, an awareness, like he was being watched, measured. Wade, the bus idled. He stood up. "You," he said, pointing to the boy. "Come up here. You're gonna show me how to open this damn thing." The boy stood, walked slowly down the aisle, and stopped beside him. Up close, his face was pale, too pale, like something had drained him of blood. His eyes didn't look quite right either. The whites were grayish. His lips barely moved when he spoke. "This is where it ends." "No, it's not," Carl snapped. "We're getting off, all of us. Now." The boy turned and pointed toward the back of the bus. Carl followed the gesture, hard hammering. One of the seats was gone. Just gone. In its place was a jagged hole. That opened into darkness, too deep for the size of the bus. The hole looked wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. There was a faint sound coming from it, something like breathing, or wind through broken glass. Carl stumbled back. No, this is some kind of sick joke. This isn't real." The boy looked at him with empty eyes. "It's always real." But only after sundown. And then the bus moved again, backward this time, wheels turning slowly, inching toward the hole. The kids didn't scream or cry. They sat quietly, as if they'd done this before, as if they'd never gotten off. Carl threw himself at the controls, trying everything, punching buttons, pulling levers, slamming his shoulder into the emergency exit. Nothing worked. The edge of the hole crept closer. He could feel it now, the cold rising from it like breath from a deep grave. The boy stepped back into the aisle and sat down. The engine groaned, coughed, and died. The last thing Carl saw before the darkness swallowed them was the dashboard clock flipping to 7 p.m. Sharp. They never found the bus. Van Horn replaced it. Life went on. But sometimes when the wind dies down and the sun slips behind the hills, you can hear an engine out on the old back roads, climbing towards something that isn't there. It started on a Tuesday when the heat hung over Crane like a wet blanket, thick enough to slow the tick of the dashboard clock. The route was the same old ribbon of cracked highway that ran past the empty cotton fields and the rusted water towers. The kind of place where your breath felt dry before it even left your lungs. I'd been driving that bus for 12 years, seen kids with scraped knees, kids who slept through their stops, kids who screamed because something small and cruel had happened to them at home. I had never seen anything that made the hair on the back of my neck rise before the bus even moved. That day, the weathered stop sign at the edge of town had a new kid waiting. A girl named Mallory who always wore her hair in 2 braids and carried a paperback book with the cover folded over like a secret. Her eyes were big, always watching. She was the one who saw him first. He got on at the second stop, the one by the abandoned feed store, the place the town had forgotten to bulldoze. He was thin, maybe 10 or 11, wearing a hoodie with a zipper pulled up halfway, the kind of hoodie that had seen a lot of laundromats and not enough suns. His backpack was too small for school books, but too heavy to be empty. What made the laughter start was the way his head sat. It was turned all the way around so his face looked to the back of the bus. His scalp was smooth, his hair hanging down in a straight fall over where his neck should have been. One of the older boys in the front snorted and shouted something about Halloween. Kids loved weird things because they could laugh and pretend they were brave. Mallory didn't laugh. She watched him with her book closed, fingers tapping the edge like a metronome. He sat in the second to last row, the one usually empty because of the busted window that rattled unless you held it with your palm. No one said anything beyond the initial giggles. The boy with the backward head kept his body still. He didn't look around like someone would with that kind of deformity. His torso was facing forward toward the driver's partition, his feet planted like any other kid. His face, which was staring at the rear of the bus, didn't move. It was expressionless, the kind of blank you see in photographs that were taken. Too fast. I kept my eyes on the road, the hum of tires, the soft buzz of the air conditioner doing its tired best. I glanced up into the mirror out of habit, just a routine sweep, and saw the reflection of kids in the back, their heads bobbing. To the rhythm of their own lives, their chatter low and easy. He wasn't there. I kept my hands on the wheel, felt the familiar give of the rubberized grip, and told myself it was a trick of the light. The mirror was old, slightly warped, and sometimes the sun would catch the edge of a headrest and make. It looked like someone leaned over. I chalked it to that and kept driving. I heard the back of the bus go quiet, a silence louder than any screeching tire or shouting match. It seeped in like cold water under a door. Mallory's tapping stopped. The boy with the backward head leaned forward without moving his body and turned his face so it was now looking at Mallory. She didn't jerk or flinch. Her lips parted as if to say something, then closed. The kid didn't move any other part of his body. His face was still backward, but now his eyes were on her like they had finally found a target. She raised a hand slowly, not in fear, not in defiance, just a motion like someone drawing a line in the dust. Her fingers drifted over the empty seat in front of her and stopped above the aisle. The boy's face tilted, not with muscle but with something that felt like the slow turning of a thermostat. His eyes, dark and endless, met hers. She smiled. I could feel the bus settle, not from the road, but from the weight of something that had been added without the scales tipping. She whispered something I couldn't hear over the engine. The others in the back started to murmur, a low chorus. Of confusion lifting like static death, the laughter at the front died. A boy named Tyler, always the loudest, asked what was going on. He leaned over the seat, his head angled toward the rearview mirror so he could get the full effect of the joke. He didn't see the backward head either. He saw a boy sitting normal, hoodie down, hair messy, face forward. He waved and grinned, then his face slackened. He turned, leaned back, and when he looked again, he was looking hard, like trying to find something that had slipped behind a shadow. His cheeks went pale. He sat back straight, his mouth dry. "Driver," he said, voice clipped. "There's a kid back there with his head wrong. He's looking at Mallory." I pulled the bus over to the side of the road where the shoulder was wide enough for the tires to settle without scraping gravel. I killed the engine because it felt like a lullaby playing while someone whispered in your ear. "Everybody quiet," I said, keeping my voice even, the way you do with kids when something bad is about to happen and you don't want to give it any encouragement. I picked up the little microphone, the one that squealed if you barely touched it, and said, "Who's back there?" No one answered. That silence again, like a held breath that never released. I stepped down from the bus and walked to the back. The metal stairs cold under my palms, though the heat made the air shimmery. The door hissed when I opened it. The kids' eyes were all on me. Some were wide, some darting, some unblinking. Mallory was still sitting, her hands folded over the chinla. Closed book. Tyler was standing near the front, gripping the seat in front of him like it was the last thing holding him on the ground. "He's not there," Tyler said. His voice trembled. "He's not there, but Mallory keeps looking." His face was turned, and then it was like she was whispering. She smiled. I walked down the aisle, the floor creaking where old paint had worn thin. The boy's seat was empty. The window next to it rattled slightly in the breeze. There was no backward head, no twisted neck, nothing out of the ordinary except for the straight imprint on the vinyl where someone had leaned, pressed as if they'd been sitting for a long time without moving. I stared at that imprint, and in the mirror above the driver's panel I finally saw him. He was in the reflection of the rearview shield, not in the bus mirror itself. His body remained positioned forward, hands on his knees, hoodie loose, his face, backward, turned toward me. His eyes caught mine, and something inside the bus shifted like a draftsman adjusting a plan. I didn't feel fear, not at first. It was a slow kind of dread, a crawling awareness like a cold wave coming in under a door you thought was shut. The boy's lips moved. No sound came from the bus. His hands twitched the slightest fraction, and Mallory's fingertips brushed air in front of her like she was writing something invisible. The low hum in the back swelled into the sound of distant singing, soft and off-key, like a hymn sung by someone whose breath kept stopping between lines. The other kids were watching now, all of them frozen, except for a little boy in the very back who had his fingers in his ears and was humming along, oblivious maybe because he was the youngest. I stepped back onto the bus and closed the door slowly, the latch clicked loud in the thick silence. I started driving again, not looking into the mirror. The road ahead was empty except for the dull shimmer of heat. Tyler kept glancing back, his knuckles white on the top of the seat. "What does he want?" he whispered. I had no answer. I was a driver, not a priest. I turned down the radio, or maybe the radio wasn't on. I slid the bus through the town square, past the grocery store with its shuttered windows, past the rusted playground where the swings hung like broken teeth. Every stop we hit, the same routine. Kids got on and off, except the backward head boy stayed. He didn't take up a full seat. His body sat like any other child. His face was turned toward the back. When we passed the edge of town and the scrub, brush started. Mallory started talking again, her lips moving soundlessly. Tyler's breath was coming in short bursts, like he was on the verge of saying something and didn't want to give it shape. We hit the hill before the old service station, the one with the cracked neon sign that used to say "Open" and "Now" just blinked in broken stutters. The bus slowed going up. I felt a subtle vibration roll through, like an off-key bass note under a song. The boy's head turned, not suddenly, but with the deliberate patience of someone who had all the time in the world and was choosing now to pay attention. His face, backward, looked not at the back this time, but slightly to the right where the road curved, where the cattle gate had been left open last week. He lifted his hand. I didn't see the motion in the mirror. I saw it in the way the sun flared against the window, and then DIDN single quotes T. Mallory stood up. She didn't push past anyone. She rose like a boy in Sunday clothes going to receive communion. Her book was tucked under her arm. Her fingers were white around the spine. She turned her head toward the boy, and I saw her lips move as if saying thank you. Then she walked backwards slowly into the aisle. The other kids shifted like they were all suddenly underwater. Tyler yelled, "Stop the bus," but his voice came from a distance. I pulled the bus over, heart thudding in a rhythm that didn't match my pulse. Mallory kept walking, backward toward the front. Her eyes were on me, blank and calm. The backward head boy's face tilted, a fraction, and for the first time I thought I saw something like a smile. It didn't reach his eyes. It looked like the way a photograph smiles when it's been altered. She stopped in front of me. Her face was close, not touching, just hovering. Her breath was warm and smelled faintly of chalk and dust. "He wants the mirror," she said. Her voice was the sound of pages turning. I didn't answer. I was frozen in denial. "He wants me to look," she said, and pushed her face slightly forward as if to show me. Her eyes went to the mirror behind me, where his reflection sat. The air over the seats shimmered like heat over blacktop. The boy's backward head turned all the way around. His face faced forward now, but his body stayed the same. His mouth opened, and the silence broke like a dam. The sound was a low humming, 1,000 voices layered thin, and in the middle, something spoke in a voice that was not a voice. It said my name slow, like someone who had tasted the syllables and decided to keep them. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator and drove. The bus lurched forward with a violence that didn't match the gentle slope of the road. The other kids held on with white knuckles. Mallory sat back down in her seat, book closed, and smiled at nothing. The boy's head turned backward again, and the weight that had been in the bus settled like someone had exhaled. Tyler was shaking. He looked at me. "Did you hear it?" he asked. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The mirror showed nothing. Now, just the normal scattered heads of kids. Mallory's braid swung once like a pendulum, then stayed still. We made it back to town. Kids got off, whispering and glancing. Tyler walked away without looking back. Mallory stayed until the last. Stop. She stepped off, turned, and for a second it felt like she was looking straight at me. Through the windshield, through the glass, through everything. Her smile was small. She lifted her hand, not waving, just lifting. Then she walked toward the feed store that had been closed for years. She disappeared into the shadow of its warped door as if the door had always been open for her. The next morning the bus was parked where I left it. I opened the door and went to the back. There was a smear on the window next to the busted seat, a handprint pressed from the inside, fingers spread wide but elongated, like someone had been trying to stretch the skin. The seat impression was fresh. I checked the mirror. It reflected me, the cracked partition, the empty aisle, the sunlight. I drove the route anyway because that is what you do when the world rearranges itself overnight. Some of the kids still laughed. Tyler still sat up front, his eyes darting into the mirror more than usual. Mallory didn't come back. 2 weeks. Later, the town posted a missing child notice. No photograph. Just the name Mallory Jacobs, age 12, last seen walking into the old feed store. Her book was found on the counter inside. The pages had been turned and turned again, but the words were gone. Only the margins had blemishes where pencil had pressed so hard the paper tore. Her last notation, written backward in a careful, small script, said, "He wants the mirror so he can see the route he never drove." He had driven that stretch so many times he could have done it with his eyes closed, could have steered with the idle rhythm of his knees and the smell of burnt diesel in his nostrils. Azona was the kind of place that sat like a bruise on the map, a scattering of low buildings, the diner with the neon sign that flickered the way a dying eye might, the rusted water tower with its paint peeling like sunburned flesh, scrub mesquite choking the shoulders of the highway, and the thin thread of two-lane asphalt running past nothing and everything. He knew where the long straightaways would make your fingers fall asleep on the wheel, where the cattle gates creaked in the dawn wind, where the desert acted like it was listening even when no one else was around. That morning started like every other. The county bus had the same old creaks in the suspension, the same smell of wet upholstery and disinfectant, the same route sheet taped to the dash with yellowed packing tape. He checked the mirrors, did the routine walk around, waved at Marie from the gas station, who always waved back with her grimy cigarette between two fingers. The kids would wait out by the feed store, the same ones, the same sleepy faces cradled in jackets because the early light hadn't warmed anything yet. He hadn't been driving long, not enough to count the miles in the way he had counted the days when he was a kid, but enough to recognize the rhythm of the morning as something that belonged to the world. He turned the key. The engine thunked, coughed, settled into its low, steady growl. The sun was a pale coin over the eastern shoulder, not yet high, yet not the soft glow of morning either. It hung in the sky like a watchful eye that had already seen too much. He pulled out, the bus creaking under its own weight, and the world settled into that comfortable loop of landmarks. The feed store, the sagging billboard advertising a rodeo. That had been 2 years ago, the sagging culvert where the water, when it came, ran like a slow artery. He picked up the first few kids, their murmurs and shuffles a comforting static. Conversation on the bus was the same as always. Who had stolen whose pencil? Who had seen what behind the auto parts store? Whose dog had chewed a shoe? He had the radio on low, the kind that crackled like old vinyl, a country station warbling about heartbreak in a voice that seemed to stretch and bend around the notes. He checked the time on the dash clock as they crossed the narrow bridge over Dry Creek. Bed. 6:12. The sun was in the same place it had been when he left the depot. He told himself he was just thinking of something else. The kids were arguing about whether the new kid at school had actually brought a snake to class. He turned onto the highway that cut out west, a long straight line between cliffs of limestone and the endless scrub, and the radio fizzed for a second, then settled back into its low, whining hum. The sun stayed hung there, in that halfway place between rising and standing still, like someone had taken a snapshot of dawn and spread it across the sky with a smear of light. He went through the route. He thought the sun looked wrong again. When he passed the rusted mailbox that leaned like an old man waiting for a bus that had already passed. 6:12 on the clock, the same pale sun, and the same breeze that made the dried grass over the ditch hiss like a snake's breath. He did the loop, dropped off at the school on the hill, turned the bus around on that narrow back access road, and headed back. The little boy with the missing front tooth who always waved before he got off, his hand in the air like he was trying to catch the sun's attention, waved. The familiar crack in the pavement, the billboard about the rodeo. He should have been back at the depot by now. The clock read 6:12. He told himself the clock was broken. He didn't trust the clock. He had a digital backup on his watch. He checked that too. 6:12. The sun was the same coin, a little higher but not by much, like a breath held too long. He started paying attention. The second time he came up the hill from the feed store, the teenage boy who always cut across the road with his skateboard was there. Same scuffed shoes, same moody look. He'd swear the kid was in the same place he had been a half hour before. The highway stretched ahead, flat and indifferent. He watched the odometer. It crawled forward, the numbers ticking like teeth in a grin, but the landscape felt like it was wrapped in a film. He did the entire route again. Kids got on and off where they always did. He passed the same sagging billboard, the same broken fence post caught in the wind's low hum. He came back through Ozona, the diner's neon sign sputtering between. A half-hearted open and darkness, and the sun hadn't moved. He turned toward the depot, expecting something to change. The road didn't end. The depot wasn't there. There was the sign that pointed to it, the old concrete pad, cracked and decorated with desert glyphs that time and wind had drawn, but no building. The bus rolled on like it had been given permission not to stop. He yanked the wheel left then. Right. The bus obeyed the physics of motion, its tires squealing against the asphalt, but the scenery kept on spooling ahead in the same tired reel. He hit the radio off. Silence pressed into the bus like humidity. He turned off the engine. The gauges still read full, and the clock, unmoved, blinked its stubborn 6:12. He pulled off onto a gravel side road that wasn't on any of the maps he carried in his head, the kind of ribbon that had a name only an old driver lore, the kind of track the cattle used when they wanted to cross without waking dogs. The bus rolled over it, tires throwing up dust that settled back like ectoplasm, and still the sun hung there, and still the clock said 6:12. He stopped at a wash. Nothing there but rock and the skeletons of scrub that had died and dried into. The shape of fingers reaching. He cut the engine again, more aggressively this time, as if the bus might listen to his frustration. The kids in the back whispered, their voices soft as the scuttle of lizards. He told them to stay quiet, to look out the windows like they'd been trained. They stared blankly, as if the outside world were a painting in a museum and they weren't sure if they could touch it. He stepped out, the first time in a long time without the security of glass between him and the endless flat. The light did not feel like morning. It didn't have the usual thickness. Shadows from the mesquite stood at angles that should have told him where the sun was, but they pointed inward toward the road as if the ground itself had been turned inside out. He walked the length of the bus, checking the tires, the engine. The undercarriage found nothing but ordinary grime and the faint smell of something like burnt skin beneath the diesel. He got back in. The kids' faces watched him as if they'd been carved yesterday and left out to dry. No one asked why they weren't at school yet. No one asked what time it was. The bus hummed, the engine idling like a patient animal. He tried. The radio again. Static, but beneath it there was a pattern, a low, slow tapping, like someone was writing in Morse code but with their fingernails on sheet metal. He leaned close. The tapping slowed, stopped, and the sound of a desert wind came. Through, not the wind outside, but one folded into itself, carrying a hint of something that used to be a voice. He heard his own name, the way it sounded when it was said by someone who had been waiting a long time. He started taking notes, the way a sane person might when the world unravels. The time, the sun, the landmarks. The notes were identical, no matter how many times he wrote them. He would write, "Past the rusted mailbox, 612. Feed store sign half fallen, 612. Diner sign flickering." He did the route again. He watched the kids in the reflection of the rear view, sorted them like old photographs. One girl, the one with the freckle on her left cheek, turned and stared straight through him. Her pupils were too wide, like she had forgotten how to focus. The bus went by a stretch of highway where the guardrail had a fresh scrape, a line of metal torn, and he remembered doing that scrape last week, or the week before, or when he'd first started the loop. Each time he passed it, the scrape was deeper, as if time were layering affairs on top of itself, like the world was adding a fresh scar over the old, but the pain never changed. He started to do things differently. He skipped stops. He slowed. To a crawl at the cattle gate and watch the cattle lazily chew, their eyes reflecting something like his own dawning panic. Every time he deviated, the bus would correct itself without being told, the road stretching ahead to meet him, gentle as a hand guiding him back into a groove. The sun refused to move. The kids stopped speaking entirely. Their presence became a weight in the bus, a gravity that had nothing to do with physics. He felt watched, not by any one of them, but by the blank spaces between the seats, by the faded vinyl, by the shadow under the driver's seat that never matched any angle of light. On the 7th loop or the 77th, the numbers blurred like an old memory bleeding into a dream. He reached the stretch where the desert opened up like a mouth and the road was nothing but a thread of gray. He slammed the brakes. The bus shuddered, the kids jerked forward in their seats, and then quiet. The engine died with a final sigh. He stepped out again. The ground was hotter than the air, the kind of heat that sat on you and pressed. He could see in the distance the mirage on the highway, a wavering smear that looked like water and a line of broken cars from 50 years ago, and then something in front of it, not quite there, a shape like a woman in a dress that fluttered without wind. He blinked. She was gone. He turned toward the bus and saw footprints leading from the desert toward the back door, shallow, dusted over just enough to be barely visible. And then the door handle moving on its own, a slow, deliberate twist, like someone from inside was trying to get out and someone outside was letting them. He walked a little into the desert. The earth cracked like dry skin, the silence a pressure that made his teeth ache. There was no sound but his breathing and the distant unsteady shimmy of heat over sand. He walked further, past the place where tumbleweeds had piled themselves into a little sculpture that looked suspiciously like a child's hand. He stopped at a low ridge and saw something he could not have known was coming. a shallow depression in the ground, ringed with old bones, small and brittle, some of them human, some not, bleached out by time. They were arranged in a circle, not neatly, more like the remnants of a meal eaten by something with hands that didn't understand mercy. In the center, half buried, a cracked root sheet, the same kind as the one taped to his dash, the same. Yellowed tape curling at the edges. His name, his own messy scrawl from mornings ago, was on it, next to a line that had not been there before. If you want back, leave the wheel. Walk the sand. Your name will follow. He dropped to his knees. The wind, which had been absent, arrived then. It came up from nowhere, a sudden draft that wasn't cool or warm, just not the heavy heat around him. It carried the smell of diesel and something metallic under it, the faint echo of the voice that had been hidden in the radio, and the whisper that wasn't a whisper, but the impression of words settling in his skull like dust. He walked back. The bus stood there, like a waiting animal, the door still slightly ajar, the seats full and empty. He climbed in without looking at the faces. He started the engine. The sun didn't move. The clock read 6:12. He drove. He went through the route again. He didn't pick up the boy with the missing tooth. He didn't wave at Marie. He saw the woman in the dress again, now standing where the billboard was supposed to be, her outline bleeding like watercolor into the desert. She raised a hand, not in greeting, but in the slow, inevitable way a tide rolls in. He kept driving, his hands locked on the wheel, his eyes on the road, and the world stayed the same. He arrived at the depot, or the place that pretended to, be it with a feeling that something had shifted. The concrete pad was gone. In its place was sand, windswept, smooth, as if it had never been concrete. There was a small pile of rocks arranged into a rough arrow pointing back toward the highway. He got off the bus. The kids filed out, their footsteps silent, leaving no impression on the ground. The girl with the freckle looked at him once, her eyes not focusing, and raised a finger to her lips like she was asking for a secret. He stood there, the heat pressing, the sky motionless, and he felt for a moment like he was still inside the loop, that any movement might snap him back into the endless 6:12, that the only thing that had changed was the weight of knowledge sitting behind his breastbone. He walked away from the bus, following the arrow of rocks, his boots sinking a fraction into the sand that tasted like old rust and dust. He walked until the scrub turned thin, until the sun's light lost its saturation, and the world began to tilt like a ship adjusting its keel. He reached the highway. A car going east came by, a pickup with faded paint. The driver slouched, a hat pulled low. The man in the truck looked at him as if he were a mirage, then at the bus parked behind, and then down at the road. The driver waved, slow, polite, and kept going. He made his way back to town on foot, cracked heels on hot pavement, his throat dry with the taste of dirt. When he got to the diner, the neon was dead, and the place was full of people talking over coffee. He looked at the clock on the wall. On his watch 6:12. He asked the waitress if the morning had started late. She blinked, wiped a mug, and said the sun had been stuck like that all day. He laughed too loud and didn't tell them what he'd left behind in the desert, what he'd seen in the hollow ring of bones, what the route sheet had said. He told them he had taken a walk to clear his head. He went home. He hung his route sheet back on the wall, the edges of the tape curling like a smile. That night he dreamed of the bus, of the frozen sun, of endless looping roads. And in the dream he heard the faint sound of the radio again, slower like a heartbeat underwater. And the words, clear now, not whispered but spoken, as if from somewhere behind him, drive it, keep it warm. The loop needs a voice. The sand is patient. He thought about selling the bus, about letting someone else take the route, but the voice in his head, the soft pressure that had become part of waking, said it would not stop when he stopped. The next morning he went out, got behind the wheel, and the bus was already warm. The clock blinked 6:12. The sun hung like a promise. He did the route. Same stops. Same billboard. Same scrape on the guardrail. He looked up once, and in the rear view, not reflected in the glass but folded into it like a smear, saw a new driver climbing in at the depot. Hands trembling, eyes wide, the way he had been when the bus had first taken him. The new driver's mouth formed his name. He didn't remember saying it. The bus rolled forward. The sun didn't move. The road opened ahead, and somewhere beyond the horizon, in a place where the desert kept its secrets in the bones of those who took the first step, the wind carried the sound of the engine turning again and again. The heat came off the highway in waves that made the air tremble like something breathing, and the bus rolled past the shattered remains of what used to be a gas station, past the cottonwoods that had grown crooked and tall along the dry washes, past the low blue mountains on the horizon. Balmorhea was a place that wore silence like a coat, and the riders on Route 14 had learned the rhythm of its quiet morning pickups, midday emptiness, the slow, dusty slide into afternoon. That day the bus was half empty, the regulars folded into their usual corners, an old man with a thermos murmuring to himself, a woman with her grocery sack on her lap watching the road like a prayer, and a boy no one had seen before sitting behind the driver, knees tucked, knuckles white around the edge of the seat. The boy's name was Jesse, or that's what the driver would learn later, but at the time he was just a quiet shadow with a backpack too big for his frame, his hair darker than the sunburned skin around his eyes, his stare fixed on the window as the scrub drifted by. He had gotten on 2 stops back without a word, dropping his bus fare, a crumpled dollar, into the slot and taking a seat. He didn't talk. He didn't fidget. He kept watching the road like someone waiting for something that should have been obvious. The driver, Carl Early, had seen enough kids to know that particular stillness. It carried a weight, the kind of silence that held breath, that made the radio hiss in the corners as if it too were listening. The last stop before the stretch of nothing that led out toward the dry washes was an old wooden sign that said Old Farm RD in faded white paint, leaning crooked over a washed-out ditch. Jesse got up when Carl reached over with the bell, and he moved like someone stepping into a place he already knew, as if each footfall had been rehearsed 1,000 times. He turned back once, lingering in the aisle, and looked at Carl. It was an unsteady look, half questioning, half pleading. Carl nodded, a small reflexive motion. The boy's lips moved. Carl didn't hear anything. Jesse stepped down, pulling the backpack up, and stood on the narrow shoulder of the highway. The sun had knocked the sky to a pale, bleached blue, and heat shimmered over the dirt like water. There was nothing beyond the gravel and the scrub except that ribbon of a dirt road curling away and a figure far off, too small to make out, standing near the bend as if waiting. The boy raised his hand slow, deliberate, a small wave toward the figure, and then he turned and walked down the dust track. The figure waved back, a thin, distant motion that made the boy's shoulders relax. He took 2 more steps, then another, and he was swallowed in the mirage of heat and dust. The other riders didn't see what happened. The old man sipped his coffee. The woman tightened her fingers around her sack, staring out as if the emptiness might swallow them all. Carl watched through the rearview mirror until the boy vanished, then wagged his head once low, the motion of a man making a note in the ledger of his day. He rang the bell, which jangled quietly, and pulled the bus forward. The road ahead was as familiar as the back of his own hand. By the time the bus got to the depot, the boy was already a rumor, a ghost of a lost stop. No one had called it in. No one had asked for a lost child. None of the regulars mentioned him. Carl, on his break, flipped through the logbook. Jesse's name wasn't in the system. He knew the codes: missing rider, skip, dropout. None matched what had happened. He called the dispatch. "You got a kid off at the dirt track past Old Farm today?" Name's Jesse, wearing a dark cap backpack. Waved to somebody, walked off. He said, voice carrying the dry resignation of someone who had seen too many small mysteries become long, dragging problems. "Nobody called him in," dispatch replied after a pause. "There's not even a stop listed out there besides the old turnout. Maybe he got off and his folks picked him up. You sure it wasn't one of the stray summer kids? They leave and come back all the time." Carl wasn't sure. He was sure of the way Jesse had looked back at him, the way his hand had lifted and the figure had waved. He ought to have gone after him, he thought later, sitting under a popped shade tree. The bus idled behind him, letting the radiator hiss. Down. But the road beyond the shoulder was a ribbon of unreality, a pale line that drank the sun and made the scrub sway like something with slow, deliberate breathing. Carl had the timetable. There were other routes to cover. He wrote a note. On the back of the logbook anyway. Kid off at unknown stop, went down unnamed road, waved to someone far off. No follow-up. The boy's mother was not the sort to call the sheriff right away. Her name was Lisa Atkinson, and she lived in the trailer park on the west side of town, where the trailers leaned together like gossiping friends and the dog that slept in the yard had more scars than teeth. Jesse was 12, maybe 13, and he had been fixated lately, moving like someone carrying a weight that didn't belong to a child. Lisa was used to him disappearing for hours, riding his bicycle, exploring the dry and cracked creek beds, coming back smelling of dust and juniper. So when he didn't come home that evening, she thought, first, that he had wandered off again, then that he'd gone to stay with his older cousin, then that he'd gone to a friend's, then that he was somewhere in town and would show up when the heat broke. When he didn't, and the sun bent itself into a red sliver in the sky, she started driving the way mothers do, the way they look for the smallest footprint, the place where a shadow lingers too long. She found nothing. No tire tracks beyond the shoulder of the highway where the bus had stopped. No bicycle. No footprints in the soft soil leading off the dirt road. Only the faint, aberrant impression of a handprint, too clean, too sharp in a place the soil didn't usually hold form. It was near a low wash where the dirt had caved in like someone had taken a bite from the earth and left a dark, round void. Lisa stood there until the stars opened and the coyotes started their thin howling. The local sheriff, Tom Blake, an ex-high school coach whose hands were permanently stained with the faint yellow of old bandages from kitchen cuts and the smell of stale coffee, took the report. He scratched at the skin near his temple, the skin loose from too much sun. "We'll run the route, talk to the bus driver, check the surrounding properties. If he's out there, we'll find him," he said, and his voice had the gravelly assurance of someone who had promised before and kept some, failed others. Days bled into each other. The missing posters went up, Jesse's photo, his dark, solemn face, the backpack slung over his shoulder like a second skin. The town whispered. The radio station did a segment. People in the diner lowered their voices when someone mentioned the road. A group of teenagers dared each other to drive their pickups down to the bend at night, flashlights sweeping the scrub, coming back pale and quiet, saying the air got cold even though the thermometer read 90-6 and always the same thing. Kept surfacing. A story that had no formal source, like a memory someone had swallowed and then let leak out in pieces. There was, they said, a place that didn't show up on any map anymore. It wasn't for lack of trying. The county had surveyed, resurveyed, rolled over it with satellite imaging and old paper records, and nothing would pin it down. Years ago, a freight driver had vanished. A woman who delivered mail had gone missing. A hunter had gone in to chase a lone jackrabbit and had come back 3 days later babbling about a town beneath the dust, a cluster of houses that weren't. There, their windows dark and scratching sounds like someone drawing lines with a fingernail from inside. The story had the soft edge of something grown in the soil, passed from mouth to mouth until people stopped knowing whether they had heard it or lived it. Carl didn't pay much attention to the rumor mill. He was a man who liked timetables, the kind of person who measured life in scheduled stops and filled seats. But one evening, 2 weeks after Jesse's disappearance, he was driving the late route alone, the bus lights casting a weak flickering, square onto the dark stretch of desert. He had finished his last drop, and he was turning the bus around to head back when he saw a shape of light in the rearview mirror. A small boy standing behind his seat, looking at him. Carl's heart jerked. The rear view was supposed to show the empty back, a heap of blue vinyl and a stray candy wrapper. He eased off the accelerator, slowed, and the boy's figure stayed there, clear as the day, pale skin, the same dark hair. He didn't move. He didn't blink. Carl pulled over, the bus hissing as the engine cooled. He checked the camera, the old analog system that barely worked. The glimpse in the mirror stayed Jesse, looking at him from the second row back, one hand resting on the back of the seat. Carl whispered, "Jesse?" His voice sounded too loud in the dark cabin. The boy lifted his hand in the same small wave. Not the panicked motion of a lost child, but the deliberate, waiting kind. Then the image flickered. The light bent. The boy was gone. Carl didn't sleep that night. He sat in the driver's seat until dawn, the bus idle, the fans humming low. He turned the radio on low, static filling the silence, a voice from somewhere else whispering old country songs in the background. In the early light, from the corner of his eye, through the mirror, the road behind him crawled with dust motes like tiny stars. He thought he saw the shape of the dirt road Jesse had walked. Down, not faded but sharper, as if edges that had once blurred were now taking form. Carl told himself he was tired. That grief twisted the mind into seeing what it wanted to. He didn't tell anyone about the boy in the mirror. What would he say? That a missing child appeared for a second in the reflection of a bus and then vanished like a heat wave? Tom Blake would write it off. The town would call it a guilt dream. The weeks followed the same pattern. The missing posters yellowed at their corners. The sheriff's office kept folders thick with interviews. The rumor of the no-name road grew teeth, and Carl started noticing patterns. Route logs had small anomalies. Sometimes a route would list an extra stop on the back pages, ink that didn't match the original handwriting, a place that wasn't assigned. The dispatcher would mark it off as self-corrected, and the note would vanish later as if someone erased the memory. The bus's GPS, old and patched, would occasionally pick up a signal, a blinking dot on a stretch of road that didn't exist when he zoomed out. It would flicker back to nothing when he tried to trace it. Then one night a woman from the diner called. She had been listening to the radio, the same one that played the old classics, when a new voice came through. It was a boy's voice, clear, small, and it said, without preface, "I'm by the last stop on the map. I'm waiting for the next bus." Carl drove out there. The road had no name. The town didn't have a town name, not even a ghost version. The sky was a bruise and the stars had not yet come fully out. He parked the bus and sat, engine off, the hum from the taillights like a heartbeat. He waited. Nothing happened. He was about to leave when a movement flickered in the distance, just on the edge of the dust where the dirt track curled, the same bend where Jesse had walked. The figure came into focus. A boy, younger than Jesse, or the same age, standing, with the light of the bus reflecting off the sweat-soaked dirt on his face. He was looking at Carl, and he had that same look of waiting. Carl got down, and the night air was a cold slap of silence. He called out, "Jesse, are you there?" The boy lifted a hand again, small, deliberate. Carl stepped forward. The ground under his boots did not feel solid. It had a give, a subtle undulation like swallowing. The boy's face blurred, like an image going in and out of focus, edges softening. Carl reached. The boy's hand touched his. It was cold, not the breath-stealing. Cold of death. But the wrong kind of cold, the kind that felt like the inside of old photographs, like something that had waited a very long time in a place it had no business being. The boy's lips moved and Carl heard the whisper, not in the air, but a sound. Inside his own head. "Don't go," the voice said, and it was all the same voice he had heard in the radio, too high, layered, as if multiple breaths were braided into one. Carl reeled back. The boy's hand slipped away like a reflection stepping. Behind glass, where the boy had stood, the dirt was flat and unremarkable. Ordinary desert under the moonlight, but the impression of a small boot print remained, glossy and dark, as if freshly pressed, though no wind had come. He drove back to town with the engine ticking, the bus quiet around him. He didn't report it. He couldn't frame it in words that wouldn't drag the town into something older than they'd ever signed up to remember. But the next morning, the dispatch called him. There was a new entry on the back of the route log, written in a hand that trembled just slightly, the ink a deep, almost wet black. Last stop on the map, rider present. Name, Jesse. Do not attempt retrieval. Carl looked out the window at the highway leading away, at the place where the dirt road curled like a question mark. He turned the radio on low and a faint tune rolled. From the static, and beneath it, threaded through like a thin seam, a boy's voice, whispering, "I'm waiting for the next bus." People in Balmore stopped using the phrase lost when they talked about that road. You didn't get lost there. You went. The map had shifted. Somewhere, a line had been drawn in sand and held. The last stop on the map became a place the bus passed once a month on its way back from the late run, a place where the air shivered and for a heartbeat, the back row would show a boy with an old backpack looking out, waiting, and if Carl had to guess, he would say the boy never stopped waving. The first time it happened, I thought the radio was busted. The generator hummed its low mechanical song, the diesel smell clung to the air like always, and the kids on Route 14 out of Iran chattered like starlings in a windstorm. I was halfway through the stretch of highway between the feed store and the little cluster of trailers by the pecan grove when the seatbelt on the third row, the one by the window that always stuck a little when you pulled it, clicked into place with that soft, final snap. The girl who was supposed to sit there, Maddie Collins, was still trudging up the gravel shoulder, backpack dragging, breath coming in the small clouds of morning dust. The radio, which had been playing the low static hiss they called music since before dawn, rasped hard, like something had turned the volume knob with grease on its fingers. Static filled the bus, a white crackle that rose in pitch and texture until it sounded less like guide-out waves and more like the friction of dry skin being scraped across paper. Then the voice came, soft as someone speaking from under a pillow, but shaped enough that even a noise-shy kid would have heard it clearly. "Maddie?" I froze. The steering wheel went a fraction of an inch in my hands. The kids went still. Even the rustle of plastic backpacks quieted. Maddie, panting, with that soccer bag slapping her calf, glanced up at the bus. Her eyes flicked to the third row window where the seatbelt was already drawn across the cushion and fastened. The metal latch shone like it had been clipped along. Time ago, the belt itself pulled taut, a wrinkle in the fabric as if someone had sat and slid in and then left. "Maddie." The voice said again, softer, like someone whispering through a cracked screen. It came through the radio, but the clarity, the pronunciation of her name, the way it hummed under the static, felt like it was leaning over her shoulder. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, one foot on the gravel, one in the air, her face folded as if she were trying to sort a smell out of the air. I kept my hands on the wheel. The other kids were looking, but their faces were spaced between curiosity and the kind of instinct that tells you to leave a thing alone because your mother once said not to touch the hot stove. "Maddie, the seatbelt is already buckled," I said, trying for a casualness I didn't feel. My voice had that thin, high-kept edge to it, the kind a man uses when he doesn't want the tremor to show. She came up the steps. The voice stopped. The static smoothed back into the gentle hiss, like the ocean flattening when a sudden wind dies. She sat. The seatbelt clicked over her waist with that familiar sound, like metal and cloth making peace, and she shrugged and went to her usual place, humming something about practice. I didn't tell her what I heard. I didn't tell anyone. Iran is the kind of place that has the same gossip for a week and the same silence for a month. You keep the things that make the hair along your arms stand up to yourself, because when you talk, they settle in other heads like a seed and grow into something you cannot unsee. The second time it happened, it was the same seatbelt, but with a boy who had moved into town a month earlier, a quiet kid named Tyler, who had the habit of they called the back of his shirt the shadow side, because he stood in it like it was a comfort. He got on the bus 3 mornings later, and the belt snapped into place before his scuffed sneakers touched the floor. The radio static climbed like a swarm of bees and then focused, and the voice whispered in the same breathy softness. Tyler didn't flinch. He smelled the way new kids smell, like they've been trying to map the world and aren't sure where they fit. He looked over at the belt, and the buckle glinted like a mouth opening. He sat, buckled up, and the radio went quiet. That afternoon, he got off at the trailer with the broken porch swing, and that night he slept in a room that had no curtain, watching streetlights slice his ceiling in thin rectangles, sweating like he'd swallowed fireflies. On the third day, the seatbelt was buckled before school came, and the voice through the radio said a name I didn't know, quiet but with the weight of something that had been waiting. The kid who heard it was Josie Ramirez, 8 years old, with a way of speaking that turned small words into sharp stones. She froze in the aisle, eyes wide. The kids around her thought she was playing, then saw her face and went quiet. She didn't sit in the belt seat. She wouldn't. For the rest of the week she rode in the front, hands gripping the metal bar like it was a lifeline. I started checking that seatbelt every night, when I cleaned the bus, when I wiped the smudge of oil from the yellow flashing light controls. I tugged it, snapped it, unbuckled and buckled it back. It was normal fabric frayed at the edges from years of use, a small dark stain near the latch, the kind of unnoticed bruise a thing gets from living. Whoever or whatever was doing the buckling wasn't using its hands on the mechanism. It was a click in the world, a soft settling into place, like a memory clicking in behind the eyes. Then, on the morning, the wind was coming through the desert like a whispering threat. Before the sun had fully bled over the horizon, I found the seatbelt, already buckled with no one near it. The bus had been parked behind the mechanic shop overnight. The kids weren't due for another hour. The air felt colder than it should have for early March. I went to the third row out of a habit that had become a ritual, and the belt was fastened. The radio, which had been dead quiet, flared with static. The voice said my name, Dale. I was the only Dale in town. I drove the bus. I hadn't told anyone I had heard anything. The sound of my name from that crackling, humming thing was sharp enough to make the skin between my shoulder blades prickle like a dozen tiny hands. The static didn't die down after I said nothing. It built. Under the heavy hiss there was something else, a softness like the pause after a breath, and then a second whisper layered under the first. Sit. I am not a superstitious man. I am not one for the kind of stories that get told around the old well or by the creek when the sun goes down and the moon is just hanging like a coin in the sky. I am a man who drives a bus, feeds his dog out of a bowl, makes sure the kids get to school, and pays the property taxes. But the urge to slide into that seat, buckle the belt around me, and feel the static rise again was there. It sat under my skin like a fever. I slammed the latch open with my palm, then dropped the belt back into place so hard the metal rattled. The radio went silent. I kept the engine idle and waited. The morning shimmered over the horizon. The sun came up like a bruise softening. No kid came. I sat there, hands pale on the wheel, and the feeling that someone was watching from the edge of the reflection in the side mirror didn't fade. That day at school, Maddie refused to ride in the third row seat. Tyler's mother took him out of the route entirely. The town whispered around the edges, not loud enough to turn into a story anyone would say aloud at the diner, but enough to make the day feel brittle, like a thin piece of glass under too much pressure. I didn't sleep well. My dreams were shallow, shot through with the smell of diesel and something else rotten fruit under a bed. In the dreams, the seatbelt would unbuckle itself, and the radio would play names I had heard in childhood, names of people who were long gone, half-remembered cousins, the boy who drowned in the reservoir when I was 10, the teacher who left and never came back. All of them whispered, "Sit," and I would wake up with my throat full of the metallic taste of old pennies. I started writing down the names. I kept a little notebook beneath the driver's seat, a cheap spiral one with a torn cover. First, it was Maddie, Tyler, Josie. Then, in the margins of the next page, I wrote mine, because I heard it twice more that week once in the static when the bus passed the old cemetery, faint like a sigh. And once while I was filling the tanks at the station in the hiss of the pump, the voice never said why. It never said who. It just said, "Dale," and under that, "Sit." The fourth time, it was a new kid. He had a name tag the school printed up for the first week, and the name was Aaron Blevins. He was the kind of kid who kept his hands in his pockets, even when the sun was cutting the desert into sharp pieces. The seatbelt was buckled when he stepped on, and he froze, staring at it, then at me, then at the back of the bus like he was seeing something only he could see. The static crackled. The voice said, "Aaron," but layered under it, faint, was another syllable, a trailing sound that tasted like gravel and old blood. It sounded like a name I had never heard before, a syllable that wasn't proper English, something bent around the edges. Aaron's eyes shifted toward the back row, wider than they should have been, and I saw the corner of his mouth tighten. He sat, and the radio went quiet again. He rode in silence. At the last stop before the highway, he didn't want to get off. The trailer park was across from the abandoned church whose bell had fallen years ago. I watched him climb down the steps, look back over his shoulder at me like he wanted to ask but didn't, and then go into the lane and vanish between trailers like a breath taken in. I went through the notebook and saw the name that had come under the static. The ghost sound layered beneath Aaron's. The scribble was messy, and the ink had bled a little, but I could still make out the shape of letters that could have been any of a dozen things. I traced them with my finger, and it felt like the paper dipped under my skin, like the name was a bruise. The whisper didn't stay small anymore. It spread. The kids started talking quiet, the way you do when you hear something in the walls. But you're not sure if it's the house settling or a thing hiding behind the plaster. The ones who had heard the voice, the ones who hadn't sat in the third row seats, started getting scared at night. They whispered on the bus their words, missing pieces like they were chewing them before they spoke. Maddie's little brother, who rode with her in the front, started asking why the seatbelt kept clicking on by itself in the dark when the bus was parked outside their trailer. And the only thing I could tell him was that it was the wind, because the alternative was to tell him that something was waiting, and I did not want to give it a shape. The day I decided to find out what it was, I went to the only place in that stretch of West Texas where people still believe knowing the name of. A thing gave a man a sliver of control. Old Ruthie at the highway bridge, who ran a little store and sold jerky and cold sodas from a cooler that had the paint peeling like sunburned skin. She told stories in exchange for a free pack of gum and the kind of silence that comes with age. Held the notebook in her hands, turned the pages carefully as if the names might burn her. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "That's a calling belt. They used to strap people to those when the train came through." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't know how a seatbelt on a bus out past Iran had anything to do with a train and the long-buried idea about binding. You hear the names because it's not asking permission. It's offering a seat. I asked her what that meant. She leaned in and whispered so low that the air between us felt like a skin stretched thin. Every seat in a bus is a promise. You strap in, you agree to be carried somewhere. Sometimes the promise gets broken and the thing that was riding with you stays. Sometimes it wants a new rider. The ones who hear it, if they don't sit, it takes the shape of their silence. If they sit, it takes their face and keeps it in the static. If you sit, Dale, it wants to trade. I told her I wasn't buying anything, and I left with her looking at me the way you look at a dog you've seen only snap once but are sure will bite again. That night I drove the route, the notebook heavy in my jacket pocket. I watched the kids get off, their legs swinging, their backpacks slapping, and I kept my eyes on the third row. The next morning, the seatbelt was not buckled. I breathed easy. I thought maybe whatever had been leaning on the edge of things had backed off, that maybe Ruthie was just a woman with too many stories and a taste for free gum. I went to dip the coffee thermos in the holder and the radio flared. The static bristled like a cat on a porch in a storm, and the voice said, "Dale." Then it said the name underneath. I understood it this time, clear as cracked glass. It was mine and someone else's. The other name was in a language that felt older than my father. Older than the highway, something like a rusted shape of a word you knew was wrong but could not unrecognize. The tone of it was hungry and tired. "Sit," it said. "Sit and take the quiet. Take the road. We will ride together, and the kids will never hear the name again. They will ride safe, and I will be free again. Just sit. Just one time. Trade?" The seat. The belt unbuckled itself slowly, like a breath leaving a body. I could have driven the bus that day without stepping into the chair. I could have removed the belt, thrown it in the back, parked the bus in the yard and left it to rot. Instead, I opened the driver's door, climbed up, and sat. The seat was warm, like someone left it in the sun. I pulled the belt across my waist. The metal clicked out. The static wasn't a sound anymore. It was a pressure, 1,000 thin hands pressing from inside the skull, and under that the voice, soft, silky, not quite mine but slipping like a shadow over something I had always thought of as mine. "Good," it said. "Remember their names. Feed them. Drive them. Keep the road. I will be in the quiet. We ride. We trade." I thought I would scream. I thought I would tear the belt off, jump out while the bus was going 50 down the highway, and the wheels would explode under me and I would be done. Instead, I drove. The radio played the names like a lullaby, and the whisper that had been my own settled into the static behind the talk, faint, reminding me of the sequences of stops, the way the kids shifted, the way the fog came in over the pecan trees. The kids didn't see anything. They didn't hear the voice that said their names anymore. They only heard the usual murmurs, the hum of the tires, the shuffling of backpacks. When the bus pulled into the depot that evening, the seatbelt unclicked itself and the voice was gone. The notebook under the seat had a new name in it, written. In a hand I didn't recognize and did not remember writing. The letters curved like something half remembered from a dream. When you wake but can't hold on to because the day's light makes it slippery. The next morning, Maddie got on. The seatbelt was already buckled. The radio crackled with static. She turned toward the back, eyes narrowing. I looked at her, and the voice, soft and familiar, whispered her name. She sat, and the static smoothed. Her little brother tugged at her sleeve and asked if she was okay. She said yes, and the bus rolled on. I don't tell the story straight. I tell it in pieces when the kids are older and the town is quiet. They ask why the radio sometimes purrs like a cat when the wind is. Right. Why the third row seat always feels colder than the others even on the hottest afternoons. I tell them it's nothing, that some things just have more patience for the road. And they nod because that is what you do when grown-ups give you pieces of the truth that don't fit together. Sometimes. When the highway is long and the sun is a thin coin in the sky, I hear a name I don't recognize. It comes from the static, and under it, soft, is something that sounds like me. I feel the seatbelt tug at my waist like a reminder, like a hand on a shoulder. I look in the mirror and for a second, in the reflection of the highway behind us, there is a shadow of a face at the wheel that is not mine and is. I keep driving. The kids don't hear anything. They don't know the cost of the quiet. I put their names in the notebook, and the page curls slightly, as if the paper is breathing. I have driven this route for 23 years. I thought the road would wear me down. Instead, it bound me tighter to the seat, to the static, to the tiddy. Whisper that now says my name, and sometimes, just after it, another voice, softer, older, that says, "Thank you." Ms. Harper had driven that stretch of highway outside Big Lake 100 times in the 10 years she had been teaching 5th grade. The straight ribbon of asphalt cut through flat scrub and dusty mesquite, a place where heat hung low and shimmering, like a promise you could not trust. She had taken kids out there for geology field trips, for outdoor writing assignments, for the Science Museum's satellite exhibit about the Permian Basin. The desert felt like something that had always been there and would always be waiting, indifferent and patient. That morning the sky was the kind of pale blue that made everything look washed out. The sun already pressing down so hard that the air over the highway bent and wavered like breath over a stove. Eli Mahoney had been quiet in class all week. He was the kind of kid who made himself small in the corner of the room, not because he was shy, but because he wanted to keep from being noticed. He wore old sneakers that had been patched with duct tape, his shirt usually a size too big, a lopsided cap that concealed the thin scar running along his scalp from a childhood. Fall the school nurse had once called a mystery. He never volunteered but watched things the way a boy watches, the way shadows gather and pull apart. Miss Harper thought he was smart. He wrote in a tiny cramped script, and when she had asked him once, quietly, if he liked drawing, he had nodded and slid her a folded paper that, when she unfolded it later, had pages and pages of black, jagged lines crossing each other like veins in rock and shapes that looked like ripples frozen on the surface of something too dark to name. She kept it in her desk and told herself she would ask him about it. But the end of quarter chaos swallowed afternoons whole, and the question stayed behind her teeth. On the bus, the kids were excited the way kids always were on field trip mornings, loud and restless even before the engine idled. The bus driver, Hank, a man with sun-cracked knuckles and a radio that only worked when it wanted to, had a tired smile and let them chatter because it made his day go faster. Eli sat near the front, not too close, not too far, next to Jenna Brooks, whose mother had texted Miss Harper that morning to remind her to watch Jenna's peanut allergy like a lit fuse. Jenna leaned into Eli with the easy familiarity of a girl who had been assigned to him as a seat partner by the school system, and Eli didn't flinch. He held his hands in his lap, and his knuckles were gray, almost the color of the underside of a storm cloud. but she chalked that up to some oddity in skin tone and didn't think about it again. They were about 30 minutes out when Hannah. Lewis, the chaperone, whispering to Ms. Harper from her seat behind the driver, said, "Do you smell that? Like burnt rubber and something else." Ms. Harper sniffed the bus air. There was a faint oily tang, the scent of old machinery, and a wet, earthy smell that belonged to rainstorms that never came. She turned and scanned the kids. The noise had dimmed as the kids, sensing the pause in adult conversation, made their own quiet noises, fidgeting, whispering. L.A. was staring straight ahead, his pupils a fraction too wide for the morning light. Something dark threaded the edges of his hairline as if the blackness was sweating out from beneath the skin, like oil seeping through cracked concrete. They stopped at the turnout off the highway, the place where the tour guide from the small, privately run desert museum would meet them. The kids poured out in a rush of noise and sunscreen smell. Ms. Harper took her usual roll call, ticking names and smiling at the way the dry wind tossed hair on the girls and pulled the edges of shirts in the boys into ragged sails. Eli stood, still by the bus, not joining in the noise. His shirt clung to his back with a dampness that did not glisten in the light the way sweat should have. Instead, it was matte, like something had dried there and was still soft. And when he shifted, a dark line ran down from his temple into the collar of his shirt and pooled at the base of his neck. "Eli?" Ms. Harper said, soft, the way a teacher uses a student's name when she wants to reach him without being loud. He turned his head just enough for her to see. The skin around his eyes had a slight sheen, a wet reflection, and black flecks gathered in the fine lines near his mouth, like tiny scars weeping. He opened his mouth, and a smell came out, one part diesel, 1 part old pennies left in a damp basement. He whispered, "It's in the ground," and then, as if someone had pulled on a thread, the blackness in his skin began to move. It started at his wrists, thin dark threads rising like smoke from his pores, knotting and twisting over his skin. The other kids heard the shift. Their chatter slowed. Jenna looked at Eli and backed away, her mouth shaping a silent, "What is that?" The dark threads collected into beads and slipped from his skin, falling to the ground not as drops, but as small globs of tar that sizzled where they touched the hot dirt, leaving behind shallow black scars on the earth that shimmered and pulsed as if the ground was breathing around them. "Get back," Ms. Harper told the kids, her voice ripping through the busyness because her body knew before her mind did that. Something was wrong. Hank, who had been tightening his grip on the wheel, turned. "What is happening with him?" he asked. Eli's body had not moved. He was still standing, hands locked at his sides, and yet the ground beneath him was darkening. In a spreading pattern, like spilled oil soaking outward in rings that grew faster than logic allowed. Ms. Harper stepped toward him. Eli's eyes flicked to hers, and for a second there was a clarity there that made her think she had gotten through. Then the blackness surged. His skin, the way the light caught it, looked like heat rising from asphalt. The air between them rippled, the kind of heat haze that makes distant objects shimmer as if they exist in water. Eli opened his mouth again, and the whisper was not sound she could hear so much as a pressure pushing against the inside of her skull. The words arrived like a memory not her own. "It isn't ending. It never ends. Keep driving." The bus. Radio, silent until then, crackled. Static filled the space between the wind and the desert. Lily, a quiet boy in the back who had been doodling in his notebook, looked up and mouthed, "Ms. Harper," the window. She followed his gaze. The rearview mirror's reflection showed Eli standing on the gravel, but there was also behind and around him a shape like a faint smear of darkness not quite contained by his silhouette, a ripple of depth where the desert should have been flat. She looked back at Eli, and the space between his knees sloughed away, not in a clean cut, but in a soft melting, as if sand and skin were bleeding into each other. His body remained upright, then bowed without moving, and the backpack slung over one shoulder slid to the ground. The zipper was open, and the contents spilled out in a slow cascade as if gravity had been given time to think about it. The other kids screamed and ran without instruction, the sound a single animal howl born of the sudden wrongness, scattering. Across the scrub, Miss Harper grabbed for Eli, reflex, and her fingers hit nothing. There was no resistance, just a surface that gave like the top of a pond when a stone sinks beneath. The air filled with that same oily scent, stronger now, and in it the sound of wind that wasn't wind, a humming that vibrated the teeth in. Her jaw, Eli was gone. The backpack lay on the ground, heavy, its Velcro flap flapping slowly, though there was no breeze. Inside were the normal things a fifth grader packs for a field trip, a half-eaten granola bar in a wrapper that had the edges stained with black, a water bottle with tiny cracks that had dark fluid collecting in the bottom like rainwater trapped in a gutter, a school-issued tablet whose screen flickered with static, and beneath those, his notebooks. The same jagged drawings she had seen before, only now the lines had depth, as if the black ink had pooled into the page and was breathing. Between the pages was a small plastic dinosaur, a cheap toy with a missing tail, its molded eyes filled with a slick dark film that reflected the desert like a dark pupil. Hank had already jumped out, shouting for everyone to get back on the bus, his voice high and thin, the way panic colors a man's timbre. Some of the kids obeyed, the ones who hadn't seen too much. Jenna stayed rooted where she was until Hannah pulled her arm and hauled her toward the bus, her face pale, her hands curled like claws around the strap of her backpack. Miss Harper picked up Eli's backpack. The weight was wrong. It felt as if there was something inside, not just heavy, but waiting, like a heartbeat under. A nylon lining. She opened the zipper more, the black fluid already bleeding into the seams, and the air around it grew colder, the way the temperature drops when shade from a storm hits the pavement. "Drive," she told Hank. His hands were shaking. He looked at her as if he'd expected her to say something different, some explanation that would let him treat it like a broken axle. "Drive now." He did, and the bus lurched onto the highway, the engine screaming a protest, and they moved forward as if pulled through honey.mis. Harper sat down and forced the kids to be quiet, not with the usual cheerful command, but with a cold, low voice that scrambled the edges of their high school field trip excitement into compliance. She had the assistant chaperone count, confirm, double count. Eli's name was missing, but his backpack sat on the seat beside her, anchored by the seatbelt, as if she had made a choice to keep it close. When they got back to the turnout, the place looked the same in the rear view as it had in the front. Driving away, the desert swallowed the small black circles that had been left behind like bruises, and the silence on the bus settled, thick and muffled, like a bruise on the skin of her thoughts. Eli's backpack had a warmth now that pulsed faintly, just enough that she could feel it if she rested her palm on the zipper. She slid a hand under the strap and found the small plastic dinosaur embedded in the mesh pocket, its missing tail more pronounced, the black film inside its eyes shifting the way oil on water does when you tilt the surface. The next day, the newspapers wrote about a missing student, a child who had vanished on a school trip. The story quoted sheriff's deputies, the museum guide, the parents. They talked about how the bus had been late returning, how the highway was straight, and how they saw nothing on their cameras. Some of the anchors on local morning shows mentioned field heat and mass hysteria and the way kids sometimes wander off. Miss Harper watched without blinking. That afternoon, she went to the county records office and found, buried under a stack of yellow dispatch logs from the 70s, a 3-line entry about oil seep incident affecting minor, evacuated, unresolved. The handwriting was scratched. The ink faded, and someone had written in a different hand, "Child returned to ground. Subject not to be discussed again." No name. No explanation. The black fluid didn't stop with Eli. That night, Ms. Harper lay in bed and felt the pull of it under her skin. In the bathroom, she saw, under the harsh light, tiny dark beads forming at the base of her fingers. She washed them away. The next morning, one of the boys, Lucas, brought in a scab from his knee and showed her. The skin around it had a thin, dull line running through like a vein of tar. He was complaining of dreams where he had been walking across a flat expanse and the sky stayed the same color, and the ground beneath his feet wasn't ground, but something that moved like a shallow wave, and a boy was calling to him, saying, "Keep driving." She didn't tell anyone. She couldn't. The backpack sat in her closet wrapped in an old towel, and at night she would hear, faintly, a whispering, not with words but with pressure, as if someone was trying to press a message into her sleep. The small plastic dinosaur would shift, sometimes to be facing the door when she woke up, though she had left it facing the wall. Its eyes glinted with that oily film, and the black in them seemed to settle into the kind of focus that was looking back. Eli was not gone. That was the part that unsheathed her mind and dragged her under. He was somewhere between the layered sediment and the asphalt, a thing untethered, unraveling, and rewinding in the same breath. And he had picked her because she had seen him, because she understood the shapes in the notebooks the way a miner reads the cracks before the blast. He had used the field trip, the road, the wide open stretch of nothing, to pull her close enough that she'd carry whatever it was that needed carrying, like a relay runner picking up a baton soaked with tar and déjà vu. Weeks later, when the Tidekingenfenchi Uzenman of picking up a baton soaked with tar and déjà vu. Weeks later, when the tar and déjà vu. New school year began, she drove past that identical stretch of highway and felt the road pulse slightly under the bus tires, as if something under it was waking, vast and slow, like a buried animal stretching after a long sleep. Eli's backpack was still in her closet. The small plastic dinosaur had a fresh crack along where the tail should have been. Inside the crack, a dark liquid gathered, and when she cupped it, warm and sticky, a whisper came up through the porcelain of her sink, gentle as a promise and sharp as a knife. "Keep driving." The first time the horn failed was a Tuesday in late June, the kind of heavy heat day that sits on Marathon like a wet blanket, making the horizon shimmer and the road look like a ribbon of melted tar. Jace Harlan had driven Route 385 for 12 years, the same bus, the same rattle in the dashboard behind the cracked air vent, the same kids sprawling in their seats like tired summer ghosts. He knew the rhythms of the town. When the diner's coffee pot gurgled too long, when the sheriff's pickup rolled by with the same two dogs watching from the bed, when the wind off the Davis Mountains smelled like distant rain even if the sky was a flat, merciless blue. He also knew his horn. It had a particular baritone blare, a sound so worn into his hands that if it failed, a rare thing, he usually fixed it before the next morning route. That Tuesday, it didn't work. He pressed the button on the wheel and got nothing. He tapped the rim, cursed softly, and kept driving. The kids complained about the heat, pushed window shades, traded stories about the summer carnival coming through Alpine, and a dozen other small, forgettable things. The horn stayed silent. He thought about it again the following week when the horn stayed silent. Sky began to twist gray in the far distance, a band of clouds gathering like a bruise over the western ridge. The bus had the smell of old vinyl and spilled soda. The hitch of the student aid's laugh. The girl, Maggie Barker, who sat in the third row by the back window, was always loudest when the wind picked up. Maggie had the kind of face that was thin where it mattered, wide-eyed without being naive, and those dark curls that never seemed to stay pinned down in the Texas wind. She had been assigned the seat under the air vent, right beside the buses. Old radio, sometimes flickering with static that scared the younger kids, but she said it felt like a heartbeat. Jace liked that she watched the road. Kids these days stared at their devices. Maggie watched the empty stretches and could tell you when the deer would jump the ditch on the south side before they even stepped into view. The storm came late on a Thursday. A thing that rolled in not gradually, but like a snapped rope. 1 minute the sky was the same pale, washed out blue, and the next it deepened into a velvet almost black. High cirrus stripping away in the wind, the clouds underneath swollen and greenish yellow. Marathon went quiet before the thunder, like everybody held their breath, the way the desert does when something big is coming that it has no name for. Jace had the route mapped in memory, but the bus was empty save for the school kids returning from a science fair in Alpine. They were tired in that restless way children are after a half-day full of buzzing, fluorescent lights, and the chatter dulled to sleepy murmurs. Maggie, as always, sat with her notebook open, writing something in tiny looping script with a pencil that had a stub of a broken eraser. When the first crack of thunder hit, the air itself trembled. The bus lurched as a gust slammed into its side. Rain didn't fall. It exploded against the windshield like shards of glass. Jace guided the bus onto the shoulder, the wipers working furiously, sliding the water away in imperfect sweeps. The sky lit up with a flash that burned the memory of it into the pupils, and the bus's internal lights flickered in a rhythmic stutter, like a breath held and released. He reached for the horn automatically, a muscle memory built on years of staring through deer crossings and tourists who drifted too close on the two-lane. He pressed the button. Nothing. He hit it again, harder. Still silence. He glanced down, annoyed, and saw that the little fuse box under the dash had a single green light blinking on a timer that had always meant power good. He tapped it, swore under his breath, then saw the storm's reflection in Maggie's window. Her reflection was there, thin and pale, her eyes wide. He didn't register the look as anything more than the way lightning makes skin translucent. Until the blare finally came. It was not the sound of a horn. It started like a low moan from the guts of the bus, then twisted into a wail that vibrated into bone. It ripped through the thunder and turned all the static into a high, clean cut of sound. The kind of sound that makes the inside of your skull feel soft and raw, like something beneath the skin reacting with a pressure it had no business feeling. Kids screamed, a raw, involuntary chorus leaking into the wet air. The radio in the corner, long silent the way old radios are when their time passes, crackled to life, and the static coalesced into something like a low murmur, almost words. Jace's right hand slumped on the wheel. The horn had blown free on its own pure sound, pouring out not from the bottom center, but like from everywhere at once, filling the bus with a tone that felt like someone had shoved a barbed wire down the throat and was pulling it back up. Maggie's head snapped toward him. Her mouth hung open. Her pupils were already huge black coins when she pressed her palms to the sides of her head. Blood bead after bead sprung from her ears and slithered down, mixing with rain that seeped through some unseen leak and ran in thin, glistening tracks across the vinyl seat. She pressed harder, her knuckles disappearing into that strange, wet sheen of dark blood. Her eyes rolled upward like she was trying to look at the ceiling without moving her head. The sound cut, not gradually, but like a faucet slammed shut. Silence followed, and it was worse than the horn. It was the kind of silence that tasted like metal and the absence of breath. Jace swung the bus into the parking lot behind the general store. The blacktop puddled and glossy and killed the engine like it might be the only thing left that could be controlled. The kids were crying quietly, some of them already in the arms of their parents, waiting with wet hair and worried faces. The school nurse came with her small black bag and a slow, efficient way of moving. Maggie didn't move. She wasn't unconscious, but her body was a cage of tension and the blood kept leaking from her ears in thin, thread-like streams. Jace had called it in while the nurse worked, and the sheriff's deputy, a wiry man named Collins, was all ready. There, flashlight bobbing under his arm like a ritual, they got Maggie off the bus. The nurse Hardin, a woman whose face had deep lines that were laughter, etched more than worry-worn, was quiet. She asked about allergies, about medications, about trauma. Maggie's lips formed words in staccato bursts. It was in the horn. It knew my name. I heard the highway crying. The sound came from inside. It wanted me. It's under the seat. Under the seat. That had been the kind of odd thing a child might say with some wild imagination when asked about a nightmare. The deputy was all ready, crouched, running a flashlight under the seat where Maggie had been sitting. Vinyl sagged, the springs exposed in one place like ribs. He saw the scratch marks, first 3 long, shallow grooves carved into the metal underside of the seat, not fresh gouges, but raw enough that the silverish metal beneath looked like the streak of something trying to pull itself free. The scratches were in a pattern that could have been accident, except they weren't random. They arced in a slow spiral, each one overlapping the next, like a curl of hair drawn tight by fingers. There were smears of something dark in the grooves, not blood, not oil, something that shimmered and shifted if the flashlight hit at the right angle, almost like wet fever dreams. Later, after the ambulance took Maggie away, after the kids were sent home with parents who kept glancing back at the bus as if it might still be humming, Jay sat alone in the driver's seat. Rain had softened to a mist, feathering off the mountain ridges, and the town's neon signs were smeared into halos by the leftover wet. He touched the horn again. It worked. The same familiar low blare answered him, solid and useless in the pho. Quiet. He didn't mention that when he pressed it, there was a faint ringing, the kind that happens after a sound so sharp it leaves its shape behind in your ears. He didn't tell anyone that, for a second, just a fraction, he heard a low, muffled voice whisper his name with the same tone Maggie used when she wrote in her notebook, Jace. Don't look under the seat. Maggie stayed in the hospital for 3 days. Tests showed nothing structurally wrong with her inner ear. No ruptured drums, no infection, no sign of trauma except for 2 small hemorrhages behind the eardrums. The bleeding had stopped. Her hearing, bizarrely, was sharper on the left side than before, as if the noise had opened up something. She was silent for a while, barely speaking. When she finally talked, it was in the voice of someone who had swallowed a bad taste and kept it there. She drew furiously on the pads of the hospital paper, sketches of the horn, the window, the storm, the underseat spiral. She kept muttering words like, "The shape wants to get out, and it keeps asking me to let it breathe." They released her with a tablet of something to steady her nerves and a paper bag for anxiety breaths. The doctor recommended therapy. The sheriff recommended that Jace take a different route for a few days. And Jace, who had spent his life layered like old paint, kept quiet. The bus was washed. The scratch marks remained. Hardin said they should be recorded. The deputy said he'd take pictures and file it under weird, needs watching. No one except Maggie wanted to say the name. If anything, the town's. Rhythms changed. People listened for a horn if their kids took the bus. They took longer to get into cars, checking under seats, flipping their mirrors with a deliberate, held breath. The storm passed. The mountains dried. Heat came back like a slow animal. And then, 2 weeks later, a faint ringing started at the edges of the town's hearing. It was only when the wind came from the south, late afternoons, the way light slants, before it softens into evening. It was the horn, but not the horn. It was a low sound, the kind that rests below sound, a protest or a plea, and if you stood too long in it, you could feel the pressure behind your eyes like the need to blink. Had become a command from somewhere else. One evening, Maggie didn't come to school. Her mother said she was tired. She wanted to sleep early. Jace saw the bus roll out, the same route, the same windows, kids pressed into seats like pressed flowers. Maggie's seat was empty. He felt the absence the way a missing beat in a familiar song rattles the teeth. The ring in the wind was stronger that day, a slow crescendo under the creak of the bus, and the distant hum of air conditioners dotted thundered again that night. Not a summer storm, not rain and electrical discharge that crackled without being in the sky. A pressure wave that rolled through the town and left hair standing on necks. An old radio static making the air shimmer in the dim light of the diner. Jace was at the depot, finishing paperwork, when the horn sounded from outside. It wasn't the low baritone he knew, and it wasn't the twisted scream from the storm. This one was quiet, almost intimate, a single, long note that carried the weight of everyone who had ever heard it and was asking a question in the tone of a child begging not to be forgotten. The sound came not from the bus, but from under the depot's concrete eaves, thin and sharp. It was followed by a small, soft crack like a fingernail drawn through wet sand. Then a second, and the air went thin. Jace went outside. The wind had stopped. There was no rain. The depot's lights flickered. The horn was silent. He walked to the back of the bus. The seat where Maggie had sat was now occupied by a girl he didn't recognize. Her arms folded, staring out the window with the same wide eyes Maggie had once had. The bus had its passengers still, the route still running, the town still breathing. In lazy, resigned ways. He opened the door and called her name. She didn't turn. He tapped her shoulder. Her skin was cold like the underside of a metal meal tray. He asked if she was okay. She lifted her head slowly, and for the first time in days, Jace heard a voice that wasn't Maggie's, but borrowed from around her, layered like fabric over old scars, say, in Maggie's exact cadence. "It's hungry again, Jace. The horn. Wants to go home." He reached down, compelled, and looked under the seat. The spiral scratches had widened. The dark smear inside them pulsed, as if breathing. There was a thin seam, like a cut in the metal, and from it, something slick and wet slowly unrolled, a film that caught the fluorescent light and showed movement. That wasn't there, a flicker of a girl's hand reaching, pulling. Maggie's notebook lay beside the seat. On the last page, written in her small looping script, were 2 words, "Tell it no." Jace didn't. He had driven the bus, taken the route every day since he was 19. He knew what you did when something grabbed at the edge of the world and whispered your name. He pressed the horn. The sound came out clean, low, a pure baritone then. Shifted, just a fraction, like someone inserted their nails into it and twisted. The girl in the seat dissolved. Not with a scream, not with a mess, but the way fog dissipates around a lamppost, leaving dark dampness in the shape of absence. The seat was empty. The smell of wet earth lingered. The ring in the wind went silent for the first time since the first storm. Maggie was never seen again. Her house sat on the ridge above town. Her mother locked the door tighter each day, staring at the space in the hallway where the whiteboard used to have their schedule. The sheriff never filed a missing person report because there was no body, no evidence. Only a seat with a fading scratch pattern and a notebook that would not open anymore no matter how many times her mother tried to pry the pages apart. Pages had sealed themselves in a smooth, hard skin, the pencil marks inside visible like fossils in amber, and stuck forever to the last written line. Tell it no. Sometimes, on wet afternoons when the sky thickens and the wind comes from the south, the townspeople say they hear a horn that isn't there. A distant note that sounds like a question and a warning. and if you stand still, you can feel something. Scratching from underneath, like a slow tap of fingernails asking to be let out. Jace drives still. He keeps his eyes forward, his hands tight on the wheel, and he doesn't look under the seat. He doesn't speak the part of the story that would let the thing know he remembers. He has learned to keep the horn quiet when the wind carries the tear. Wrong kind of whisper. He has learned that some horns are not for warning. Some are for answering, and the answer is a weight that settles in your chest and never quite leaves. The last time the horn sounded on its own, it was not during a storm. It came on a clear, blue morning, and it bled a single tone that carried through the empty streets like a slow cough from an old body. Jace felt the pressure in his ears like the beginning of a headache and heard, under the sound, the thin, trembling voice of a girl he once knew saying, "It's still under the seat." "Don't tell anyone." He did not answer. He kept driving.